Cecilia Fenwick was gentle 5'4", dark brown hair coiled at a low plaited knot at the nape under a small lace cap, soft dove-grey eyes the colour of the coquet under a March sky, fair Northumberland complexion, in unrelieved black mourning bombazine for her late great-aunt the testatrix. She sat at the observation cabinet at the south parlour of the Rothbury parsonage, reducing the meridian altitude of the winter sun, lately taken at the Friday before noon at the parsonage south garden quadrant. The parsonage boy with the Northumberland post knocked twice at the south door. Cecilia set the small brass quadrant gentle at the green baize at her right hand. She took the letter at the boy's hand. The black mourning wax held the cipher of Mr. Rothbury Grey, solicitor of Pilgrim Street, Newcastle. She broke the seal at her ungloved hand. The first 4 lines, that her late great-aunt, Mrs. Octavia, Eleanor Fenwick of Fenwick Hall, in the parish of Fenwick-on-Coquet, had died Friday the 3rd of December last in the 74th year of her age, and that by the will lately proved at the consistory court at Durham, Mrs. Fenwick had named her great-niece, Miss Cecilia, sole heiress. Mrs. Snitter, the parsonage maid, came at the parlour door with the breakfast tray. At the black wax, she observed in gentle Northumberland worry that surely Miss Cecilia shall faint, that the estate-keeping at Fenwick Hall was no work for a curate's daughter, and that Sir Bertram Ogleby of Ogleby Hall near Morpeth shall have the estate by Lady Day if she did not lay out the matter at once at Mr. Rothbury Grey of Pilgrim Street. Ogleby shall have it, she said again. Cecilia did not answer. At the observation cabinet, the small instruments of her 5 Northumberland years stood at the small mahogany trays, the brass altitude quadrant of Mr. Troughton of Fleet Street, the 2-drawer pocket telescope in green shagreen at its black ribbon, the 3-inch celestial pocket globe of Mr. Carey of the Strand, the small lead pencils and the parallel rule and the cards of smoked glass at the cedar slipcase. At the south sash, the nautical almanac and astronomical ephemeris for the year 1819 lay open at the December page at the small reading stand. At the left of the observation cabinet, Mr. James Ferguson's 1756 Astronomy explained upon Sir Isaac Newton's principles stood at the oak shelf beside Mrs. Margaret Bryan's 1797 A Compendious System of Astronomy. The black mourning wax had a Newcastle weight at her ungloved hand. The December Coquet Valley morning came soft and cold at the south sash. Through the open south door, the fresh rosemary kept the gentle parsonage smell of early winter. The pale flax-grey Northumberland light held the brass quadrant at the green baize. Cecilia did not argue. She took up the small ivory-handled dividers at the cabinet's brass tray, set them gentle at the figured sheet, carried the reduction through at the refraction table at the almanac's page, found the meridian altitude of the sun at 11 degrees and 19 minutes at the Friday observation, and laid the dividers at the green baize. She crossed to the dark blue calf observation journal at the writing table, took up the quill, and wrote, "Meridian altitude of the sun, 11 degrees 19 minutes, taken at the parsonage south garden Friday 17th of December 1819, reduced and entered at the south parlour Tuesday 21st December, the shortest day of the year, the sun at its southern standstill, and the Northumberland post at 10:30. She blotted the page and read the letter through. What was Sir Bertram's claim, named only as a paper, requiring the consistory court's notice at the Thursday following chambers, reading at Newcastle? And would the observation work at the Star House continue at Fenwick Hall at all? Mrs. Snitter had set the breakfast tray at the parlour table. Cecilia took up the parsonage tea, ate the small portion of seed cake, and at the close of the cup wrote at the second sheet a short note at Mr. Rothbury Grey of Pilgrim Street, Newcastle. She accepted the appointed day at the chambers, reading it Thursday the 6th of January 1820, named the Rothbury Newcastle chaise at the Wednesday previous, and asked that the chambers should be at her father's company at the appointed hour. She sealed the note at the small Fenwick parsonage seal her father kept at the west study, and gave it at Mrs. Snitter for the Northumberland post the following morning. The pale flax-grey Northumberland light at the south sash held the parsonage south parlour at the close of the morning, and Mrs. Snitter at the hall door said in her gentle Northumberland worry, one further time that Ogleby shall have it by Lady Day, and went out at the hall to the parsonage kitchen. At the close of the December afternoon, Cecilia took up the brass quadrant careful at her ungloved hand, and set it at the second tray of the observation cabinet at the labelled brass. Troughton Quadrant, South Garden, Rothbury, December 1819. She closed the cabinet at the small brass turnkey her father kept at the west study, set the dividers at the brass tray at the cabinet's head, laid the dark blue journal at the writing table beside the letter and the second sealed note, and stood at the south sash a moment at the gentle, pale, flax-grey Northumberland light. The sun had come to its southern standstill at the shortest day at the Green Bays, and the Northumberland post had been at the parsonage south door at 10:30. Cecilia did not, at the south sash, set out the matter at any further turn of her mind, and at the close of the south parlour light, she went out at the hall to the parsonage kitchen at her father's company at the curate's plain supper. Thursday the 6th of January, 1820. The Newcastle morning came down Pilgrim Street in plain January light, and the lantern tower of St. Nicholas stood at the south under a soft, pewter Northumberland sky. A thin tyne frost had laid itself over the cobbles before the daylight had risen, and the iron railings at Mr. Rothbury Gray's chambers at number 14 still held the silver of it. The Rothbury Newcastle chaise had set Cecilia and Reverend Ambrose Fenwick down at the Queen's Head at Pilgrim Street at the gentle Newcastle hour the Wednesday evening previous, and the Queen's Head's plain Northumberland breakfast had been at the South Coffee Room at the morning of the Chambers reading. Reverend Ambrose had taken at the Queen's Head the plain Coquet Valley silence of a curate whose only daughter had been at no Newcastle chambers before, and shall not at the first Newcastle chambers be set at any speaking out of the Northumberland post. Mr. Rothbury Gray was 62, silver spectacles, plain dark Newcastle broadcloth. He received the Fenwicks at the chambers hall, and led them through at the south chambers at the long writing table at the Pilgrim Street window. The chambers clerk, Mr. Corbridge Tyne, small, plain, in a careful Newcastle coat of dark grey, had laid out the will, the inventory, the schedule of the West Library, the chambers ink, and the small pewter ceiling set at the south writing table. Mr. Rothbury Gray bowed Reverend Ambrose to the south armchair at the chambers fire, bowed Miss Fenwick to the south chair at the long writing table, took up his silver spectacles to the nose, and said in his settled Newcastle manner that the late Mrs. Fenwick of Fenwick Hall had asked at her own particular instruction that he should read the will aloud at the Fenwicks' hearing at the chambers reading of the day appointed. He took up the will at the head of the writing table, 6 pages in Mr. Corbridge Tyne's plain chambers hand, the small Durham consistory stamp at the head, the careful red ribbon at the seal. He read, "In the name of God, Amen. I, Octavia Eleanor Fenwick, widow of Fenwick Hall in the parish of Fenwick-on-Coquet, in the county of Northumberland, in the 74th year of my age, being of sound mind, memory, and understanding, praise be therefore given to Almighty God, do make and publish this my last will and testament in manner and form, following. First, I commit my soul to Almighty God, who gave it me and my body to the parish ground of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick-on-Coquet, at the south wall beside my late husband, Sir Lionel Fenwick, the 3rd Baronet, The burial to be at the plain Northumberland manor the Reverend Felton shall appoint, and at no further charge of mourning at the parish than the parish customary. Second, I give, devise, and bequeath unto my great niece, Miss Cecilia Anne Fenwick, of the Rothbury Parsonage, only child of my late niece, Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick, born Ogleby, and of the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick, her widowed husband, curate of All Saints of Rothbury, all that my manor of Fenwick Hall, with the messuage and the South Manor House, and the 172 acres of Holmhof and Simonside Edge Sheep Walk, the walled north garden with the Star House observing pavilion at the head wall, the damson and apple orchard at the west, the West Library of 426 volumes, the Fenwick family plate of 74 pieces at the Newcastle Assay of 1787, the sum of 2,800 sterling at the 3% consolidated stock, my own bound observation ledgers of 1784 through 1819 at the West Library writing table, the Herschel correspondence bundle at the West Library cabinet, the great 5-foot achromatic telescope of Mr. Dolland at the Star House, with the micrometers and the smoked glasses thereto belonging, and Mr. James Ferguson's 1756 Astronomy, explained upon Sir Isaac Newton's principles at the West Library shelf, all to her sole and separate use, and to her heirs and assigns forever. Third, I give and bequeath unto Mrs. Marjorie Thropton, my housekeeper at Fenwick Hall these 26 years past, the sum of £100 sterling, and the small oak parlour timepiece at the housekeeper's room, in gentle acknowledgment of her settled keeping. Fourth, I give and bequeath unto Mr. George Harbottle, my steward at Fenwick Hall, these 24 years past, the sum of £100 sterling, and the grey Cheviot cob at the West Stable, in careful acknowledgment of his settled keeping. Fifth, I give and bequeath unto the Reverend Jonas Felton, curate of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick-on-Coquet, these 15 years past, the sum of £50 sterling, and the small folio of Bishop Taylor's Holy Living and Holy Dying, 1700 at the West Library, in careful acknowledgment of his parish keeping. Sixth and last, I nominate and appoint Mr. Josiah Rothbury Gray of Pilgrim Street, Newcastle, solicitor, sole executor of this my last will and testament, with the full authority of the Consistory Court at Durham. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and seal at Fenwick Hall, in the parish of Fenwick-on-Coquet, in the county of Northumberland, this 9th day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1819. Octavia, Eleanor Fenwick. Witnessed, the Reverend Jonas Felton, curate of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick-on-Coquet. Mr. George Harbottle, steward of Fenwick Hall. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid the will at the writing table at Cecilia's hand, and was silent. Reverend Ambrose Fenwick at the south armchair said nothing. He had taken at the chamber's fire the plain Northumberland silence of a curate who has heard a thing at the consistory court reading, and shall not at the first hearing set it down in any other manner. Cecilia read the will over once at her own hand, at the plain Newcastle daylight from the Pilgrim Street window, folded it at its first crease, and laid it at the chamber's writing table. Mr. Rothbury Gray then drew up from the chamber's dispatch case the 6 items the will had appointed. The first was the copy of the will itself, at Mr. Corbridge Tynes plain chamber's hand, 6 pages, the schedule of the 172 acres of Holmhof and Simonside Edge Sheep Walk, and the walled north garden and the damson and apple orchard, and the West Library of 426 volumes, and the family plate of 74 pieces at the Newcastle Assay of 1787, the 2,800 in the 3%, the 4 servants, and the parish curate and the executor. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid it at the chamber's writing table at her hand. The second was a brass ring of 6 keys at a plain length of black ribbon, the south door of Fenwick Hall, the West Library, the muniment room at the east, the plate chest at the strong room, the walled north garden gate, and the smallest of the six, a night key of blued steel, the door of the Star House at the garden head wall. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid the ring at the chamber's writing table, and the brass at the January daylight had the dull, warm tone of plate that has been at a Northumberland housekeeper's keeping these 26 years. The third was a banker's draft at Messrs. Hoare of Fleet Street for 2,800 sterling, drawn at the 3% stock and made out at the order of Miss Cecilia Ann Fenwick of the Rothbury Parsonage, Northumberland, dated the 3rd of January 1820, countersigned at the Newcastle Agency the Tuesday previous. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid it at the chamber's writing table. The fourth was the calling card of Reverend Jonas Felton, curate of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick on Coquet, with at the verso a written line in his plain Northumberland hand, "I shall wait at the south door of Fenwick Hall at Miss Fenwick's arrival." J.F. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid it at the chamber's writing table. The fifth was the calling card of Lord Peregrine Charles Embleton, 4th Viscount Embleton of Embleton Park, lay patron of the Fenwick on Coquet living, with at the verso a written line in his plain hand, "At Miss Fenwick's settled time." Embleton. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid it at the chamber's writing table. The sixth was a second sealed letter. The wax again the small Fenwick cipher of Mrs. Octavia's hand, and the 3 Fenwick sprigs of ash, the direction at the face in Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's own settled writing. To the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick, curate of All Saints of Rothbury, at the parsonage, at the proper time after Mr. Rothbury Gray's reading. Mr. Rothbury Gray laid the sealed letter at Reverend Ambrose's hand at the south armchair. The 6 items lay at the chamber's writing table at the Pilgrim Street January daylight. The will at the head, the brass ring of 6 keys at the black ribbon, the 2,800 draft at Messrs. Hoare, the calling card of Reverend Felton, the calling card of Lord Embleton, and the second sealed mourning letter at her father's hand. Mr. Rothbury Gray took off the silver spectacles, laid them at the writing table, and at his settled Newcastle manner set out one further matter at the chamber's reading. Sir Bertram Ogleby of Ogleby Hall, near Morpeth, had lodged at the Durham Consistory Court the Thursday of the 30th of December last. Only 7 days previous, said Mr. Rothbury Gray in his careful Newcastle manner. A folded paper claiming a parole trust of the August of 1818 over the south half of Fenwick Hall. The paper named a private interview at the Star House at Fenwick Hall at the evening of the 31st of August 1818, at which Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had, at Sir Bertram's stated account, set out the matter of a settled trust at her own hand at the great telescope she had then been observing at the Star House. The moon was named in Sir Bertram's paper, as at the full at the said evening, the night very bright over the Coquet, though Sir Bertram's paper did not at the Consistory Court set out the hour at the first lodging. The matter shall require interview at Fenwick Hall at the Thursday se'nnight, following Miss Fenwick's arrival, with Mr. Heddon Sir Bertram's barrister at the matter, and Mr. Rothbury Gray shall come up at the Newcastle chaise at the appointed day in his own settled chambers company. He set the matter at the close of the reading at the plain Newcastle manner of a solicitor, who shall name a thing at the table, without setting it at the table's weight. Mr. Rothbury Gray then said his settled Newcastle instruction. The chambers should be at Miss Fenwick's command at any morning of the 12th night week. If she would write at the Friday following her acceptance at the will, and her appointed day at the arrival at Fenwick Hall, he should send word at Mrs. Thropton, and at Mr. Alwynton, and at Mr. Harbottle, and at Reverend Felton. The 6 keys would then be at her hand at the south door of Fenwick Hall at the appointed day. He drank the careful Newcastle tea Mr. Corbridge Tyne had set at the chamber's fire. ate a plain Northumberland biscuit at the chamber's plate, and at the close of his second cup, took his leave at the chamber's hall. Reverend Ambrose saw him at the Pilgrim Street south door. The Fenwicks took the short Newcastle walk south to the Queen's Head, ate a careful plain Tyneside dinner at the South Coffee Room, and at the close of the afternoon took the Rothbury Newcastle chaise at the chamber's appointed manor. The chaise set them down at the 3 half-moons at Rothbury at the gentle Northumberland hour, and the parsonage gig had carried them at the half-mile at the close of the evening to the Rothbury parsonage south door. At the parsonage south parlour, Reverend Ambrose Fenwick set the candle at the writing-table, drew the small black silk ribbon at his cassock pocket, took up Mrs. Octavia's sealed mourning letter at her own settled Fenwick hand, set the letter at the parlour writing-table, took up the silver paper knife at the chimney-piece, and broke the wax. He stood at the south sash and read in plain Northumberland silence. Cecilia sat at the parlour chair at the south window and did not look at her father's face. The candle at the chimney-piece took the small amber light of the parsonage tallow. The brass ring of 6 keys at the black ribbon lay at the writing-table beside the will, the 2,800 draft, the 2 calling cards, and the closed dark blue observation journal. And at the south sash, the January Northumberland night came on at the parsonage south garden in the plain manner of a Coquet Valley winter. At the close of the reading, her father folded Mrs. Octavia's letter, laid it at his cassock pocket, set his hand once at her shoulder, and went out at the parlour door to the west study without a word. Cecilia did not ask him at the matter of the letter. She sat at the south window a long while at the chimney-piece candle and the dark blue observation journal at the writing-table, and at the close of the evening she rose, took the parsonage candle at her hand, and went up the parsonage stair at the south door of her own chamber in the plain Rothbury manner of a curate's daughter at the close of a long Northumberland day. The Friday following, the 7th of January, 1820, Cecilia sat at the parsonage writing-table at the south parlour, and at her own plain hand wrote at Mr. Rothbury Gray of Pilgrim Street, Newcastle. She accepted the bequest at the will, accepted the appointment at the 6 items, named her appointed day at the arrival at Fenwick Hall at Saturday the 15th of January 1820, and asked that he should at the Newcastle post Monday send word at Mrs. Thropton the housekeeper, and at Mr. Alwynton the butler, and at Mr. Harbottle the steward, and at Reverend Felton the parish curate. She signed the letter, Cecilia Ann Fenwick, at the parsonage of Rothbury, sealed it at the small Fenwick parsonage seal her father kept at the west study, and sent it at the Newcastle post that afternoon at the parsonage boy. She wrote at the second sheet a short note at Reverend Felton at the parish living of Fenwick on Coquet, in the plain Northumberland, hand the parish curate would know at the first glance that she should be at Fenwick Hall the Saturday the 15th of January 1820, and that she should be at St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick on Coquet the Sunday the 16th of January 1820 at his parish service. She sealed it at the same small Fenwick seal and sent it at the same Newcastle post. She wrote at the third sheet a careful note at Lord Embleton at Embleton Park, Northumberland, in the plain hand the lay patron of the parish living was owed at his calling card, to say that she had received at her hand his lay patron card at the chambers reading at Newcastle, and that she should be at Fenwick Hall the Saturday the 15th of January, 1820, in her late great-aunt's appointed manner. She did not say more. She sealed it at the same small Fenwick seal and sent it at the same Newcastle post. At the close of the Friday se'nnight following, the 14th of January, Cecilia went to the parlour writing-table at the observation cabinet. She set the 3 marbled board observation books of 1815–1816, 1816–1818, and 1818–1819 at the small cedar travelling box the parsonage kept at the West Study, set Mr. Ferguson's 1756 Astronomy Explained upon Sir Isaac Newton's Principles, and Mrs. Bryan's 1797 A Compendious System of Astronomy at the box beside them, set the dark blue observation journal at the head of the box, and set the small brass quadrant of Mr. Troughton and the cards of smoked glass at the cedar slipcase and the small lead pencils at the body. The nautical almanacs of 1815 through 1820 at the small parsonage shelf she lifted careful at her ungloved hand, wrapped each at the small Northumberland flannel the parsonage kept at the West Study, and laid them at the small cedar travelling portfolio at the head of the box. The observation books she packed first, before the small Northumberland gowns the parsonage kept for her at the chamber press, before the small Fenwick household linen, before the parsonage prayer book. The plain Northumberland gowns and the small parsonage household linen and the parsonage prayer book went at the second box. At the small drawer beneath the south parlour writing table she found the 4 letters of Miss Caroline Herschel of Slough, to her own hand, of the Michaelmas of 1817 through the midsummer of 1819, and she laid them at the cedar portfolio beside the wrapped almanacs. She did not yet know whether Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's own Herschel correspondence bundle at the West Library cabinet at Fenwick Hall should be at the same Miss Herschel's hand. But the matter was at the Saturday following, and not at the parsonage writing table. Her father came down at the parlour at the close of the packing hour, with a small fold of pale cream paper tied at a thin black mourning ribbon at his hand, and he said in his plain Rothbury manner that the fold had come at his hand at the Michaelmas of 1819 from Fenwick Hall in the same parcel as a private letter on the matter of Cecilia's own astronomy correspondence at Miss Herschel at Slough, and that Mrs. Octavia had asked the fold should go at Cecilia's hand at the proper season, and the proper season was at the packing list. Cecilia took the fold at her ungloved hand and laid it unopened at the dark blue observation journal at the head of the cedar box, in the plain Northumberland obedience of a curate's daughter at a father's settled instruction, and her father went out at the parlour door to the West Study at the parsonage candle. Mrs. Snitter came down at the parlour with the second tray, and said at the gentle worry of the parsonage maid, one further time, that Ogleby shall have it by Lady Day. If Miss Cecilia did not answer Sir Bertram at the Chambers manor Mr. Rothbury Grey had laid out at Pilgrim Street. Cecilia did not answer. She set the cedar travelling box at the south door beside the second box, set the brass ring of 6 keys at the parlour writing table beside the 2,800 draft and the 2 calling cards and the closed dark blue observation journal, and at the close of the January afternoon stood at the south sash a moment in the plain Rothbury silence of a parsonage curate's daughter at a packing list the parsonage had not at her 26 years before set out. The Rothbury parsonage south parlour at the close of the afternoon held the cedar smell of a parsonage West Study packing list, and at the south sash the January Northumberland night came on at the parsonage south garden in the plain Coquet Valley manor. Cecilia set the candle at the writing table at the dark blue observation journal, and at the parsonage south parlour silenced the brass ring of 6 keys at the black ribbon lay at the writing table at her hand. Saturday the 15th of January, in the year 1820, came in upon the Coquet Valley at a pale flax-grey sky, a thin frost rime upon the dry stone walls at the lane to the Rothbury parsonage, and a gentle wood smoke at the chimney of the south parlour, where Cecilia Fenwick had passed her last breakfast, at the table where she had taken every breakfast since she was a girl of 10. The widowed Reverend Ambrose Fenwick sat at the head with the Newcastle newspaper folded at his elbow, and a small dish of marmalade at his hand, and he did not speak much because Cecilia did not speak much, and the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who had spent a lifetime in the same rooms and did not need the comfort of words to know what the other was thinking. Mrs. Snitter had laid out the portmanteau and the observation journal and the brass quadrant at the hall table, and the Rothbury postboy was come down at the door with the small farm cart that Mr. Harbottle, the Fenwick steward, had sent across the country from Fenwick Hall at the first light of that Saturday morning for the carriage of Cecilia's portmanteau and her instruments. Cecilia went up to the south parlour a last time. The observation cabinet stood at the south wall, as it had stood these 5 years, the small instruments at their mahogany trays, the Troughton quadrant of the Friday before reduction lately set out at the topmost tray, the parallel rule at the second, the cards of smoked glass at the cedar slipcase at the third, and she touched the glazed door at the brass knob a moment and did not open it, because the cabinet would come down at the farm cart at the second journey at the afternoon, and she had set the order at Mrs. Snitter at the breakfast hour. She came down. Her father stood at the parsonage hall in his curate's black coat. He kissed her at the brow once, and he said only that he should expect her at the Sunday dinner the Sunday following at the parsonage, if the Northumberland weather held, and Cecilia said that she should come. And that was all the leave-taking that was wanted between the curate and his daughter for the 3-mile country between Rothbury and Fenwick on Coquet. The post-chaise was the small one-horse fly from the yard of the 3 half-moons at Rothbury, a local short hop of 3 miles west up the country lane along the Coquet to the parish of Fenwick on Coquet. No proper post-stage, no change of horses, no inn upon the road between. The single-hired conveyance carried Cecilia at the gentle pace of a Northumberland winter morning out at the west gate of Rothbury, across the stone bridge of the Coquet, and up the lane at the north bank, above the wharf that ran along the river for the full 3 miles west to the gates of Fenwick Hall, the fly arriving at the south drive at the close of the morning. The south door of Fenwick Hall opened upon a flagged hall of Northumberland, squared sandstone, and a tall mullioned window that looked out at the south wharf above the Coquet, and Mr. Alwynton the butler bowed once at the threshold and said in a plain Northumberland gravity that Fenwick Hall was Miss Fenwick's at her command. Mrs. Thropton, the housekeeper, in her lace cap and her plum bombazine, came forward at the inner step and curtsied gentle and said that the west library fire had been laid at first light, and that the south bedchamber above the west library had been aired the 3 days following the funeral against Miss Fenwick's coming. Mr. Harbottle, the steward, weathered at the cheek from 40 Cheviot winters at the home wharf, took his plain dark hat at the hand, and said that the rent book and the steward's accounts lay at the west library table at Miss Fenwick's pleasure, whensoever she should be inclined to take them up. At Mr. Harbottle's boot heel, an old black and white sheepdog with a grey muzzle and one wall eye came forward at the flagged hall at the gentle stiff pace of her 13 years, and set her nose once at Cecilia's ungloved hand, and Mr. Harbottle said that the dog was Mab, the late Mrs. Fenwick's own, and that Mab had lain at the Star House threshold at every clear night of her mistress's keeping, and had not gone up at the garden these 6 weeks past. Mr. Harbottle brought down the inventory at the west library table after Cecilia had taken a cup of tea at the south parlour, and had walked the south passage at Mrs. Thropton's gentle pace. 172 acres of home wharf and orchard and walled north garden, 426 volumes at the West Library shelves, catalogued at Mrs. Octavia's hand in a Newcastle-bound ledger of 1806, 74 pieces of plate at the Newcastle Assay of 1787, set down at the strong room at the basement under the housekeeper's key, and £2,800 at the 3 per cents at Messrs. Hoare at London, standing at Cecilia's name from the Tuesday following the Consistory Court's grant of probate, with the rent roll of the home wharf and the 5 cottage tenancies at the parish of Fenwick on Coquet, standing at £460, the year clear of the land tax and the parish rates. Cecilia went out at the south door at the close of the noon hour. The coquet ran along the foot of the south half at the low winter water, a pale silver ribbon at the pale flax-grey sky, gentle at the bend below the damson and apple orchard at the west. The Simonside Ridge stood dark and high at the south across the valley in the long whale-back of its winter heather. The upper crags pocked at the small grey outcrops of the fell sandstone. At the far northwest, beyond the home, Sheepwalk, the Cheviot stood high and pale at the snow of the border country, and the manor itself at her back was a Northumberland squared sandstone house of 1747, 2 stories, a steep slate roof at the pitch of the border winters, crow-stepped gables at the east and the west, 3 chimneys at the ridge, stone-mullioned south windows at the ground and the upper floor, the south front, the warm honey grey of 70 years of coquet weather. At the head wall of the walled north garden, above the bare damson tops, stood the small octagonal observing pavilion of the same squared sandstone, the Star House, its leaded roof carrying the long hinged shutter slit of the meridian at the north-south line, its small oak door at the blued steel night key, set there at Mrs. Octavia's own order in the year 1784 at the first spring of her marriage. She stood a long minute at the south Hoff gate, looking at it all, and she did not speak. She went into the west library at the close of the afternoon. The room ran the full depth of the west front of the manor, a long warm room of squared sandstone chimney-piece at the north wall, oak shelves at the east and south walls bearing the 426 volumes of Mrs. Octavia's library, 2 long oak tables at the west windows for the laying out of charts and the spreading of figures, and at the northwest corner under the deep mullioned window stood a tall walnut cabinet of shallow shelves that Cecilia had not seen at her last visit to Fenwick Hall in the September of 1817, because Mrs. Octavia had been at the Harrogate Waters at that fortnight, and the west library had been kept locked. Cecilia drew the glazed door at the small brass handle. At the shelves, in careful year order, stood 35 bound yearbooks at dark green calf, each lettered at the spine in small gilt capitals, Fenwick Star House, with the year beneath, the first at 1784, the last at 1819, the observation ledgers of Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's own hand across the 35 years of her marriage and her widowhood, 2,841 clear Northumberland nights catalogued at the careful copper plate of a Coquet Valley astronomer, every entry at the head with the date and the weather and the company, every observation at the body with the hour and the instrument and the object. At the south end of the cabinet, upon a small reading shelf, there lay a quarto index ledger, bound in dark green calf and lettered at the spine, Fenwick Star House Index, 1784-1819, and beside the index, a small black leather portfolio, tied at red tape, bearing at the cover in the same copper plate the words, Miss Herschel, Slough, Correspondence, 1812-1819. At the long north shelf above the walnut cabinet stood the 4 and 50 nautical almanacs in plain blue paper boards, the first at the year 1767, the first of Dr. Maskelyne's publishing, the last at the year 1820, each spine lettered at Mrs. Octavia's small ink italic with the year, not 1 year of the 4 and 50 wanting. At the west window bay, the small Jones portable orrery of Holborn stood at its mahogany box at the reading stand, and the pair of Mr. Carey's 12-inch globes stood at their mahogany tripods, and at a velvet tray at the second table lay the brass micrometer eyepieces of the great Dolland and the cedar slipcase of smoked glasses. Cecilia sat down at the west oak table at the cabinet. She untied the red tape gentle. The portfolio held 11 letters of Miss Caroline Herschel, the astronomer of Slough, The first dated 14th of February 1812 at the Matter of the Comet of 1811, the last dated 3rd of November 1819 at the close of Mrs. Octavia's final autumn. And at the fourth letter, Cecilia read at the careful small hand of Miss Herschel's own pen the gentle words of a Slough astronomer to a Northumberland widow upon the proper sweeping of the nebulae at the moonless nights of the Coquet country. She closed the portfolio at her hand and set it at the table at the cabinet, and she did not speak, because there was nothing at that quiet West Library, at the close of a Northumberland January afternoon, that wanted speaking. The yearbooks and the Herschel correspondence had been laid down at the West Library by Mrs. Octavia across 35 years for the next Fenwick who should know the night sky of the Coquet Valley at her own hand. And Cecilia Fenwick was that next Fenwick. Mrs. Thropton came in at the West Library door at the gentle approach of the dinner hour, bearing at her hand a small calf-bound volume tied at black ribbon, and she said in her quiet Northumberland voice that the commonplace book of Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had been set down at the housekeeper's room at the Tuesday following the funeral against Miss Fenwick's coming, and she set the volume at the corner of the West Oak table and curtsied gentle and went out. At the close of the evening, before the house candles were taken up, Cecilia took the blued steel night key at the brass ring and went out at the garden door at Mrs. Thropton's lantern company, up the walled north garden, at the frost-bound gravel, to the star house at the head wall. The small oak door turned at the night key, at the gentle Northumberland sound of an oiled lock kept faithful. Within, at the lantern light, the great 5-foot achromatic telescope of Mr. Dolland stood at the stone pier at the centre of the octagon, at its brass mounting, capped at the object glass at the small leather hood, the observing chair of the late Mrs. Fenwick at its wheeled step at the pier's south side, the small deal writing shelf at the east wall at the figured cards of 35 years, and at the threshold stone beneath her feet, let into the sandstone at a thin line of brass, the meridian line of the year 1789, set down to take the Coquet noon and the southing of the stars. The old dog Mab had come up at the garden at the lantern light, at her stiff, gentle pace, and lay down at the threshold stone at the meridian line at the manner of 13 years of clear nights, and Cecilia stood at the pier at the cold January dark, a long minute, and set her ungloved hand once at the brass of the great Dolland, and did not speak. She locked the star house at the night key at the close of the minute, and went down at the garden at Mrs. Thropton's lantern at the plain Northumberland fashion, and the old dog came down at her boot heel. The Sunday following, the 16th of January 1820, Cecilia walked the half-mile across the south half and along the lane at the foot of the home sheep walk to the small parish church of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick on Coquet, at the gentle company of Mrs. Thropton, and the Reverend Felton at his plain black gown, read the morning service at the small mullioned chancel before a congregation of 8 Fenwick tenants and 3 village families, and Cecilia at the front. Fenwick pew with her gloved hands at the prayer book, and her soft dove-grey eyes at the small east window of clear Northumberland glass. The Monday and the Tuesday came in, at the gentle pace of a Northumberland winter at Fenwick Hall. Cecilia, at the West Library at the walnut cabinet, drawing down the yearbooks one at a time, and reading the entries of Mrs. Octavia's hand at the long oak table by the west window. Cecilia, at the South Half Gate at the afternoons, with the dark blue observation journal at her hand, sketching the long dark line of the Simonside Ridge above the Coquet. Cecilia at the south parlour at the evening, reading the commonplace book at the small fire, the entries gentle and short, the script close, the years from 1784, the year of Mrs. Octavia's marriage to Sir Lionel, to the November of 1819, the month before her death, Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's bell, Mr. Alwynton at the south door, Mr. Harbottle at the steward's office at the back court, the household at Fenwick Hall, settling at the new mistress at the gentle measure of a border country house. At the Monday morning, Cecilia drew down the yearbook of 1818 and read it through. The yearbook held 180 clear nights at the careful copper plate, the January occultations at the 3rd page, the spring double stars at the 12th, the June twilights thin and short at the Northumberland midsummer, the August sweeps at the heart of the volume, and at the head of every night's entry, Mrs. Octavia's hand had set out the date, the weather, and the company, and at the foot of every entry, the hour of the closing of the Star House door. At the entry of the 31st of August 1818, Cecilia read at the page in her late great-aunt's own settled italic, Monday 31st, August 1818. Company, none. Thropton abed at 11, the house dark. The moon at the change this day at the 5:30 of the evening, by the almanac's appointment. No moon this night. The air very fine after the 3 days' west wind. Swept from 10 o'clock. The double star at the head of the Swan, gold and sapphire, very fair at the zenith. The great nebula in Andromeda at the north-east from 11. The brightest I have had it at the 5 foot these 9 years. The small companion nebular plane at the field's south edge. At 1 o'clock, the double cluster at the sword hand of Perseus at the northeast, the field all powder. Closed the Star House at 2:15. Mab at the threshold the whole of the night. The finest sweeping night of the year thus far, and no moon at any hour of it. Cecilia read the entry through twice at the long oak table at the Monday morning, and she did not speak. She read then the entries at either side of it, the 8th and 20th of August, cloud at the southwest, no observation. The 2nd of September, sent this day at the Newcastle post, my August sweeps at Miss Herschel at Slough, the Andromeda night at the head of the packet, and she set the yearbook of 1818 at the long oak table at the green silk ribbon Mrs. Octavia had kept at the place of the August sweeps, and drew down the yearbooks of 1816 and 1817 and 1819, and read the Augusts of each. At no entry of any August of any year at the 5 and 30 yearbooks was the name of Sir Bertram Ogleby at the head of any night. The head of every entry kept the company at the plain Northumberland, honesty of a widow who set down her nights as other women set down their housekeeping, and the company at the 31st of August 1818 was none. At the Tuesday morning Cecilia took down from the long north shelf the Nautical Almanac for the year 1818 at its plain blue paper boards. The title leaf set out the settled words of the board. The Nautical Almanac and Astronomical Ephemeris for the year 1818, published by order of the Commissioners of Longitude, London, printed at London in the year 1815, 3 years before any night it appointed, at the computation of the Greenwich tables, for the use of His Majesty's Navy at every sea of the world. She opened the August page at the long oak table at the west window light. At the column of the moon's phases, the printed line stood at the plain Greenwich figures. New moon the 31st day, at 28 minutes past 5 in the evening. And at the column of the moon southing and setting, the figures stood at the same plain order. The moon at the said day rising and setting at the sun's own hours, lost at the sun's light, at no sky of England at any hour of the said night. The moon had been at the full at the 16th of August 1818, 15 days before the night of Sir Bertram's paper, and at the 31st it was at the change, and a moon at the change stands at the day sky at the sun's elbow, and at no night sky at all. Cecilia set the small brass paperweight at the open August page and did not speak. At the Tuesday afternoon, Cecilia took out the 11 letters of the black leather portfolio at the small reading shelf of the walnut cabinet and read them at the west oak table by the pale Northumberland light at the west mullion. Miss Herschel's first letter of the February of 1812 set down the gentle thanks of the Slough astronomer for Mrs. Octavia's careful figures of the great comet of 1811, the two streams of the tail drawn at the Fenwick, 5 foot across the September and the October nights, the head's small bright point at the micrometer's measure. The third letter of the June of 1814 set down the proper sweeping of the nebulae at the moonless nights and the keeping of the yearbooks at the Slough Manor. The seventh letter of the May of 1817 set down at a gentle line that Mrs. Octavia's great-niece at the Rothbury parsonage, whose first letter had lately come at Slough at her own small hand, promises a settled eye, and shall be answered at my own pen as the coquet posts allow. And the ninth letter, dated at Slough the 19th of September, 1818, set down at the careful small hand of Miss Herschel's own pen, the acknowledgment of the August packet, and the gentle and exact words upon the night at the head of it. Cecilia read the ninth letter through twice at the West Oak table at the Tuesday afternoon, and she did not speak. She set the letter back at the portfolio at the careful order of Miss Herschel's hand, and she tied the red tape at the small bow that Mrs. Octavia had tied at the November of 1819, and she set the portfolio back at the small reading shelf at the walnut cabinet, and she closed the glazed door at the small brass handle at her ungloved hand. At the close of the Tuesday afternoon, she drew down the yearbook of 1819 a second time and turned it at the last leaves. The final entry stood at the night of the 18th of November, 1819, a thin, clear frost night, 15 days before Mrs. Octavia's death, the hand smaller and slower at the page, but the order unbroken, the date, the weather, the company, the southing of the winter stars. And beneath the final entry, at the foot of the page, in the same small, slow italic, undated, stood one further line that was not an observation. The great eclipse of the sun shall come at the 7th of September next, at the middle of the day, by the almanac's appointment. I shall not see it at the Star House. The hand that keeps these ledgers after me shall see it for me, and shall set it down at this page at my settled asking. O. F. Cecilia sat at the long oak table at the west window, a long while at the failing January light, with the yearbook of 1819 open at the final page, and the old dog Mab at the chimney corner lifted her grey muzzle once and set it down again at her paws, and Cecilia did not speak. At the close of the sitting, she copied the line entire at her own dark blue observation journal at the central crease, and closed the yearbook at its green silk ribbon, and set it at the walnut cabinet at its place at the end of the 5:30, and went down at the south parlour at the housekeeper's bell in the plain Northumberland fashion of the house. The Thursday came in at a pale frost-bound morning, the Simonside Ridge at the south, white at the rime, the coquet at the foot of the Hoff at the low winter water. Cecilia was at the West Library at the walnut cabinet at the yearbook of 1784, when Mr. Alwynton tapped at the West Library door, and came in at her quiet word, and set down upon the West Oak table a small calling card upon a small silver salver, and bowed at the threshold, and withdrew. Cecilia took up the card at her ungloved hand. The card was of stout cream pasteboard, the printer's plate of Newcastle, the name in plain copper plate, Sir Bertram Ogleby, 4th Baronet, of Ogleby Hall near Morpeth, and at the lower left corner, pencilled small at the gentleman's own hand, the words, "Requests the honour of waiting upon Miss Fenwick at the West Library, at her Northumberland convenience, upon a matter touching upon the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's intention of the August of 1818. Cecilia set the card down at the West Oak table beside the yearbook of 1784. She did not rise. She did not call for Mr. Alwynton. She did not speak. The Northumberland pale yellow January light came in at the West Mullion at the angle of the noon hour and fell at the brass corner plates of the walnut cabinet at her right hand. She read the pencilled words a second time at the gentle Northumberland composure of a curate's daughter of 26 who had spent 4 days at the West Library with Mrs. Octavia's 35 yearbooks and Miss Herschel's 11 letters from Slough, and she did not feel the small startling at the heart that Mrs. Snitter at Rothbury would have looked for, because Cecilia Fenwick at the West Library at Fenwick Hall on the 20th of January 1820 had at her right hand the careful Northumberland night record of 35 years that no August of 1818 visiting baronet could speak across, and she knew it. She took down at the small standish a sheet of plain Northumberland writing paper at her ungloved hand. She wrote at her own gentle copperplate 3 lines to Mr. Rothbury Gray at Pilgrim Street, Newcastle, that the calling card of Sir Bertram Ogleby was lately come up at Fenwick Hall, that Cecilia forwarded the same to Mr. Rothbury Gray's notice against Mr. Rothbury Gray's standing instructions of the Thursday before at the Chambers reading, and that Cecilia should await Mr. Rothbury Gray's gentle direction at the West Library at Fenwick Hall against the receipt of Mr. Rothbury Gray's reply. She sealed the letter at a small plain Northumberland wafer and laid it at the West Oak table for Mr. Orwinton at the next Newcastle post. She rose at the West Oak table and went to the west mullioned window and looked out at the walled north garden at the head wall, white at the rime under the pale Northumberland January sky, and she set her soft dove-grey gaze at the small octagonal star-house above the bare damson tops, where the leaded shutter-slit held the thin silver of the frost, and she did not speak. A Northumberland rook at the damson orchard called once across the frost-bound Hoff, and was answered at the Simonside ridge, and the small pale yellow January sun stood at the south at the noon hour at the angle that crossed the thin brass meridian line Mrs. Octavia had let into the star-house threshold stone in 1789 to take the coquet noon. The walnut cabinet at the northwest corner of the West Library stood at her back, at the gentle steady weight of Mrs. Octavia's 35 Northumberland years. The yearbook of 1818 lay at the long oak table at the green silk ribbon at her hand. The black portfolio of Miss Herschel's correspondence lay at the small reading shelf at the cabinet, and the calling card of Sir Bertram Ogleby lay at the West Oak table beside them at the gentle pale yellow Northumberland light of a Coquet Valley noon hour, and Cecilia Fenwick at the West Library at Fenwick Hall on the 20th of January 1820 had the night record of the Coquet Valley at her own hand, and the patience of a curate's daughter at the front pew of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick-on-Coquet, and that at the West Library of Fenwick Hall at the close of the first Northumberland week of the new mistress was the careful Northumberland ground upon which the August of 1818 full moon of Sir Bertram Ogleby should presently come to rest. Thursday the 27th of January 1820 came down at the Coquet Valley with a thin, pale west wind at the Fenwick south half and a sky the colour of old pewter at the West Library window. Cecilia Fenwick was at the West Library writing table at the west sash since the breakfast hour, her unrelieved black morning bombazine plain at the wrist, a small lace cap pinned at the dark brown plaited knot at the nape, the dark blue observation journal open at her right hand, and the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's yearbook of 1818 laid out at the table before her at the green silk ribbon. The matter of Sir Bertram Ogleby's calling card dropped at the south porch on the Thursday last had been kept in the level border fashion below stairs all the 7 days following, and the household was at the table without being asked. Mr. Alwynton the butler was at the West Library door at his standing place. The Reverend Felton, the Fenwick parish curate, was at the West Library, long bench at the window, his plain black gown brushed. Mr. Rothbury Gray, of Pilgrim Street, Newcastle, had come up by the Rothbury post-chaise the evening before, and was at the long oak chair at the table. Silver spectacles set at the nose, the Pilgrim Street Chambers ledger open at his left elbow. The carriage wheels at the South Drive came at 20 minutes past 10. Cecilia heard them at the west sash and did not lift her head from the yearbook at her hand. She set the small ivory-handled dividers at the dark blue observation journal at the place she had been figuring, closed the yearbook of 1818 at the green silk ribbon Mrs. Octavia had tied it at, and laid it at the centre of the writing table at the west sash light. The nautical almanac for the year 1818 lay open at the writing table at the August page, the small brass paperweight Mrs. Octavia had kept in the West Library, all her widowhood set at the open column of the moon. The small fold of pale cream paper at the thin black mourning ribbon lay at the dark blue observation journal at her right hand. She knew her sky. Mr. Alwynton had the south porch door open before the second knock had come at the brass plate. The footstep at the West Library door was heavy and slow. A Morpeth heel at the border oak, Mr. Alwynton announced in the level Northumberland fashion, Sir Bertram Ogleby of Ogleby Hall, near Morpeth, and Mr. Hedden of the Newcastle Bar. Sir Bertram Ogleby, 55, heavy 5'9", port-flushed, mulberry silk waistcoat, smooth oiled smile, came in at the carriage step. Mr. Hedden, thin iron grey, slate wool, long buff brief roll under the arm, came in at the second step. Cecilia rose, set her plain cream linen cloth at the observation journal, and gave the small civil curtsy her late mother had taught her at the Rothbury parsonage. Mr. Rothbury Grey rose. The Reverend Felton rose. Mr. Alwynton set out 2 border oak chairs at the table, opposite Mr. Rothbury Grey and Cecilia, and withdrew at the door without sound. Sir Bertram bowed at the table in the fashion of a man who has set out to bow at a smaller party than the one in the room. The oiled smile did not move at the mouth. He gave Cecilia the Morpeth nod he kept for tenants' daughters at quarter-day. Mr. Hedden laid the long buff brief roll at his elbow, untied the green tape at the head of the roll, and drew out 3 folded papers. Mr. Rothbury Grey waited until Sir Bertram and Mr. Hedden were both seated. Sir Bertram, Mr. Hedden, the matter at this interview is the paper lodged by your party at the Durham Consistory Court on the Thursday the 30th of December last, claiming a parole trust of August 1818 over the south half of the Fenwick estate against the will of the late Mrs. Octavia. Fenwick dated the 9th of November 1819. Mr. Hedden, you may set out the claim. Mr. Hedden lifted the first folded paper at the table, opened it at the west sashlight, set his Newcastle barrister's spectacles at the nose, and read out in the thin Tyneside voice of a man who has set out the same paper at the Newcastle Assize 3 times in the year past. By the leave of this interview at the West Library at Fenwick Hall in the parish of Fenwick-on-Coquet in the county of Northumberland on the Thursday the 27th day of January in the year of our Lord, 1820, my client Sir Bertram Ogleby, 4th Baronet Ogleby of Ogleby Hall in the parish of Ogleby by Morpeth, doth claim of the said estate the south half thereof, by parole trust given out by the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick, widow of Sir Lionel Fenwick, 3rd Baronet, at the Star House at Fenwick Hall on the evening of Monday the 31st day of August, in the year of our Lord, 1818, in the matter of the Southwharf and the High Sheep Walk. The thin voice did not lift at the west sash. Sir Bertram did not move. Mr. Hedden set the first paper at the table, lifted the second, and read on. The said parole trust was given out at a private interview at the Star House at Fenwick Hall at the evening and the midnight of the said 31st day of August 1818, between the said Mrs. Octavia Fenwick, then in her 73rd year, and the said Sir Bertram Ogleby, then in his 54th year. no third party being present at the said interview, save the great telescope of Mr. Dolland at the Star House, at which instrument I, the said Sir Bertram Ogleby, saw with my own eyes Mrs. Fenwick observe the full moon, then standing very bright at the south above the Simonside Ridge at the midnight hour, the matter of the parole trust being discussed throughout the said interview between the said Mrs. Fenwick and myself, and the memorandum of the said trust being read aloud by the said Mrs. Fenwick at the Star House threshold by the light of the said full moon, no candle nor lantern being needed at the brightness of the night. Mr. Rothbury Gray did not write. The Reverend Felton did not move. Mr. Hedden set the second paper at the table and lifted the third. The said claim is therefore that the south half of the estate, the south hall of 66 acres, the high sheep walk of 58 acres, the west library, and the Star House pavilion at the walled garden head wall, are by the said parole trust of 31 August 1818, the property of my client, against the will of the said Mrs. Octavia Fenwick, dated the 9th of November 1819, the parole trust being prior in time to the will by 1 year and 10 weeks, and being evidenced by the said full moon and by my client's own oath at the said interview. The thin Tyneside voice stopped at the west sash. Mr. Hedden laid the third paper at the head of the buff brief roll. Sir Bertram lifted his smooth-oiled mouth at the corner. Mr. Rothbury Gray, the matter is plain. I saw the full moon at the great telescope at the Star House with my own eyes at the midnight of the said night. Mrs. Fenwick had the instrument at the moon the better part of an hour. The moon stood at the south above Simonside, very bright over the Coquet, and the hall below the garden was silver with it. We spoke of the South Hall and of the High Sheep Walk throughout the interview. She read the memorandum aloud at the threshold by the moon's own light. The south half is mine by the parole trust given out at the great telescope. Cecilia did not answer. She set her plain cream linen cloth at the dark blue observation journal at her right hand and lifted her soft dove-grey eyes, the colour of the Coquet under a March sky, from the table to Sir Bertram at the border oak chair across the writing table. "Sir Bertram," she said in the level fashion her father had taught her at the Rothbury Parsonage south parlour, "I beg your leave to set out 3 matters at the West Library table before we close this interview, and to ask you to look at each in turn before you sign at Mr. Hedden's paper. Mr. Rothbury Gray, may I have the leave of the interview to set out the 3 matters?" Mr. Rothbury Gray gave the small Newcastle nod he kept at Chambers. "Miss Fenwick, you have the leave of the interview." Cecilia set her right hand at the yearbook of 1818 at the writing table. The green silk ribbon Mrs. Octavia had tied at the head of the dark green calf, and laid it open at the centre of the table at the west sash light. "The first matter is my late great-aunt Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's own Star House yearbook of the year of our Lord 1818, one of the 35 bound yearbooks she kept at this West Library from her marriage at Sir Lionel Fenwick at the spring of 1784 to the 18th of November 1819, 15 days before her death at this house. The yearbook is bound at dark green calf at the Newcastle binder of the side. Mr. Rothbury Gray has examined the yearbook at this table on the Monday the 24th of January last, and has set his Newcastle initials at the head of every leaf. Mr. Rothbury Gray set out his Newcastle initials, J.R.G. at the table for the room to see, and gave the small Newcastle nod again at the west sash. "Sir Bertram," Cecilia said, "at every entry of the yearbook, from the 1st of January to the last clear night of December 1818, my late great-aunt set out at the head of the entry the date of the night, the weather of the night, and the company at the Star House, and at the body of the entry the hour, the instrument, and every object observed, and at the foot the hour of the closing of the Star House door. The yearbook sets out 81 clear nights at the said year, She kept the company line at every entry of every yearbook of the 5 and 30, as other women keep a housekeeping book. Mrs. Thropton at the Lantern, Mr. Harbottle at the Lambing, Reverend Felton at the Comet of 1811, and at the elder volumes Sir Lionel. The company line was her settled habit these 5 and 30 years, and it does not once omit a name. Cecilia turned the open yearbook at the writing table at the west sash light, so that the open page was set out at Sir Bertram and at Mr. Hedden across the table. The entry at the head of this page is the night of Monday, the 31st of August, 1818, the very night at Mr. Hedden's paper. I read the company line at the head of the entry, in my late great-aunt's own hand. Company, none. Thropton abed at 11. The house dark. And I read the second line, the moon at the change this day at the 5:30 of the evening, by the almanac's appointment. No moon this night. And I read the body of the entry, that she swept from 10 o'clock, the double star at the head of the Swan, the great nebula in Andromeda from 11, and at 1 o'clock the double cluster at the sword hand of Perseus, and that she closed the star house at 2:15, and that it was, at her own settled words, the finest sweeping night of the year thus far, and no moon at any hour of it. She lifted her soft, dove-grey eyes from the open yearbook to Sir Bertram across the writing table. At no entry of the yearbook of 1818 is your name at the company line at any night. At no entry of any of the 5 and 30 yearbooks is your name at the company line at any night of any year. And at the one night your paper names, my late great-aunt's own hand, sets out that she was alone at the Star House, that the house was dark, and that there was no moon at any hour of the night. Sir Bertram at the border oak chair lifted his oiled smile at the corner of the mouth, and gave the West Library a small Morpeth shrug at the broad port-flushed shoulder. Mrs. Fenwick did not enter every matter at her ledger, Miss Fenwick, he said in the loud Morpeth voice. A private interview upon a family trust is a private matter, and she would not have set it out at a star book as a matter of public talk. The ledger is a ledger of stars, not of trusts. She observed the moon at the great telescope at the interview between her and me at the midnight of the said night. The ledger says nothing to the matter. Cecilia did not answer at the shrug. She set her right hand at the nautical almanac for the year 1818 at her left elbow, lifted the small brass paperweight from the open page, and turned the open volume at the writing table at the west sash light, so that the open page was set out at Sir Bertram and at Mr. Hedden across the table. The second matter is the Nautical Almanac and Astronomical Ephemeris for the year 1818, published by order of the Commissioners of Longitude, printed at London in the year 1815, 3 years before the night at Mr. Hedden's paper, at the computation of the Greenwich tables, for the use of His Majesty's Navy at every sea of the world. My late great-aunt kept every almanac from the first of Dr. Maskelyne's publishing at the year 1767 to the year 1820 at the long north shelf of this West Library, 54 volumes, not 1 year wanting. The open page is the August of 1818. Mr. Rothbury Gray has examined the volume at this table on the Monday the 24th of January last, and has set his Newcastle initials at the August page margin. Mr. Rothbury Gray lifted his silver spectacles a half-inch at the nose, looked across the table at the open volume, and gave the small Newcastle nod for the room to see. Sir Bertram, Mr. Hedden, the August page of the almanac sets out the moon's phases at the plain Greenwich figures, computed 3 years before the said August and printed at London for every ship of His Majesty's Navy. I read at the column of the moon, at the printed line. She set her plain right forefinger at the printed line at the August page column at the west sash light, and read at the page. New moon the 31st day, at 28 minutes past 5 in the evening. Cecilia lifted her finger from the printed line and set it at the columns of the moon's rising and southing and setting at the same page. The moon was at the full at the 16th of August 1818, Sir Bertram, 15 days before the night at your paper. At the 1 and 30th it was at the change, the new of the moon, at 28 minutes past 5 o'clock of that very evening. A moon at the change stands at the sun's own elbow. It rises at the sun's rising and sets at the sun's setting and is lost at the sun's light the whole of the day, and at the night it is below the horizon of every county of England from the dusk to the dawn. A full moon at the midnight hour stands at the south. So far, Sir Bertram, your paper is astronomically without fault. The fault is the night. On the night of the 1 and 30th of August 1818, no moon of any phase stood above the horizon of Northumberland at the midnight hour, nor at 11, nor at 1, nor at any hour of the dark. There was no moon to observe at the great telescope. There was no moon to stand above Simonside. There was no moon to silver the hawk below the garden, and there was no moon's light at the Star-House threshold for the reading of any memorandum aloud. The brightest thing over the Coquet that midnight was the great nebula in Andromeda, and my late great-aunt was alone at the eyepiece with it. Sir Bertram lifted the Morpeth smile at the corner of the small mouth again. The smile was not quite so oiled at the corner. An almanac is a computation of London clerks, Miss Fenwick, made at a desk 3 years before the night, and never once at Northumberland. Clerk's mistake. A Coquet sky is not a Greenwich page. The moon I saw at the Star-House was at the sky, and not at a column of figures. The 1815 printing is not at the matter. Cecilia did not lift her soft, dove-grey eyes from Sir Bertram at the border oak chair. The moon, Sir Bertram, keeps one face and one reckoning over every county of England at the same hour. The almanac's figures are computed at London and proved at Greenwich at every clear night after. And at 35 years of my late great-aunt's own proving at this house, they have not erred at the moon's change by so much as a quarter of an hour. If the almanac could mistake the moon's change by a fortnight, for nothing less than a fortnight, Sir Bertram stands between the change and the full. No ship of His Majesty's Navy would find its longitude at any sea of the world. But you have said it. The moon you saw was at the sky, and not at a page. Then I shall close at the third matter, which is not a page of computation. It is an observation at the first astronomer of the age, of that very night. She lifted the third bundle, the small fold of pale cream paper tied at the thin black mourning ribbon. From the dark blue observation journal at her right hand, untied the black mourning ribbon at the west sash, opened the fold at the table, and set the letter at the writing table at the west sash light. Mr. Rothbury Gray looked across the table at the open letter and gave the Newcastle nod. The third matter, Sir Bertram, is the letter of Miss Caroline Herschel of Slough, the astronomer, the discoverer of the 8 comets, the keeper of her brother Sir William Herschel's sweeps these 40 years, at my late great-aunt at this West Library, dated at Slough the 19th of September, 1818. That is to say, 19 days after the night you have set out at Mr. Heddon's paper. My late great-aunt had sent at the Newcastle post of the 2nd of September 1818 her August sweeps at Miss Herschel at Slough, the night of the 1 and 30th at the head of the packet, as her own yearbook sets out at the entry of that day. The letter has lately come down at my own hand from the Rothbury parsonage, having been given me by my father, the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick, at the parsonage at my packing list on the Friday the 14th of January last, for the plain reason that my late great-aunt had sent the said letter at my father at the parsonage at the Michaelmas of 1819 in the same parcel as a private letter on the matter of my own astronomy correspondence at Miss Herschel at Slough since the autumn of 1817. She set her plain right forefinger at the second leaf of the open letter. Miss Herschel writes at my late great-aunt at this West Library, in her own hand at Slough at the 19th of September 1818. I read at the second leaf of the letter, the third and following lines from the head of the leaf. Your night of the 31st of August, Mrs. Fenwick, I have read with the greatest pleasure of the whole packet. No nebula can be swept at a night of the moon. The great nebula in Andromeda will not bear a quarter moon's light, far less the full, and that you had it brighter at your 5 foot than at any night. These 9 years is the plain mark of the darkest of skies. Your night was at the change of the moon, as the almanac appoints, and your coquet sky was as dark as any my brother and I have had at Slough this 12-month. I do not look for the nebula at any moonlit night, at any glass, at any county, at any year, and I do not look for a full moon at a night of the new, in Northumberland, or at any sky over England. The West Library was very quiet. The Reverend Felton at the long bench was not moving. Mr. Heddon was looking at Sir Bertram at his left elbow, with the level Newcastle bar look of a man who has heard the last paper of the morning read out by a dark-haired curate's daughter and has known at the second sentence that the brief at the Buff Roll is finished at the Newcastle Assize. Sir Bertram did not lift the oiled smile at the corner of the mouth. The mouth was set at the Morpeth line. The port-flushed colour at the heavy jowl had paled beneath the bone at the eye. The mulberry silk waistcoat had set out a small sheen of sweat at the silk. Cecilia lifted her soft, dove-grey eyes from the open letter to Sir Bertram. Sir Bertram. The moon was at the change at the 31st of August 1818 at 28 minutes past 5 in the evening by the almanac printed 3 years before the night. There was no moon above the horizon of Northumberland at any hour of that night. My late great-aunt's own year-book sets out the night moonless, herself alone, the company line at none, and the great nebula at its brightest at 9 years. Miss Herschel's own letter of 19 days after sets out the same night, at the same darkness, at the first astronomer's hand of the age. The full moon you have sworn to at the Star House cannot have stood at the sky you set it in. Sir Bertram did not move. The parole trust, you claim, rests at the full moon at the Star House. The full moon rests at the midnight sky of the 31st of August 1818. The midnight sky of the 31st of August 1818 was at the new of the moon, dark from the dusk to the dawn, by the almanac of the Commissioners of Longitude, by my late great-aunt's own hand at the yearbook, and by Miss Herschel's letter at 19 days. The parole trust cannot stand at the foot. There was no moon at the Star House at any hour of that night. There was no memorandum read at any moonlight at any threshold. There is no parole trust. The Morpeth shoulders at the mulberry silk waistcoat went down a half-inch at the chair, and then an inch, and then 3 inches, until Sir Bertram was set forward at the table at his folded forearms, the oiled smile gone from the mouth, the port-flushed colour at the heavy jowl gone pale. He did not speak. Mr. Heddon lifted the long buff brief roll, tied the green tape at the head in the Newcastle fashion, rose, and bowed at Mr. Rothbury Gray across the table. Mr. Rothbury Gray, the claim of my client, Sir Bertram Ogleby, is withdrawn at this interview. The folded paper at the Durham Consistory Court of the Thursday the 30th of December last is withdrawn. The brief at the Buff Roll is finished at the Newcastle Bar. I beg the leave of the interview to withdraw. Mr. Rothbury Gray rose and gave the Newcastle bow. Mr. Heddon, the withdrawal is at the record at the Durham Consistory Court at the Tuesday following at my own hand. The interview is closed. Mr. Heddon took up the buff brief roll, set his spectacles at the fold pocket at the slate wool coat, did not look down at Sir Bertram, and walked across the West Library to the door. Mr. Alwynton opened the door at his standing place. Mr. Heddon passed without looking back, and the south porch door at the south hall closed at his footstep behind him. Sir Bertram, at the border oak chair, did not lift the port-flushed head. The thick forearms held the weight of the broad shoulders at the mulberry silk waistcoat. The oiled smile had not come back. The heavy jowl was pale at the west sash. Mr. Rothbury Gray set the Newcastle initials at the Pilgrim Street Chambers ledger at the closed interview line. Sir Bertram, the interview is closed at the matter of the said claim. Mr. Hedden has withdrawn at the brief. Miss Fenwick has set out the 3 matters. Your late kinswoman's yearbook of 1818 sets out at the night of the 31st of August, the company at none, the house dark, and no moon at any hour, at the settled habit of 35 years of entries that do not once omit a name, the Nautical Almanac of the Commissioners of Longitude, printed at London 3 years before the said night, sets out the moon at the change at 28 minutes past 5 of that evening, below the horizon of every county of England, the whole of the dark. Miss Herschel's letter of the 19th of September, 1818, sets out at her own hand that the night was at the darkest of skies, and that no nebula can be swept at any moonlight. The full moon cannot have stood at the Star House, for the plain reason that no moon stood over England at any hour of the said night. The Parole Trust cannot stand. The interview is closed. He set the closed ledger at the writing table. He looked across at Cecilia, gave the small Newcastle nod, and said the line for the West Library to keep. Miss Fenwick, the matter is settled. The moon has settled it. Cecilia Fenwick closed the open nautical almanac at the August page, laid the small brass paperweight at the cover, set the yearbook of 1818 and the open letter of the 19th of September 1818 at the green silk ribbon at the centre of the table, and gave the small civil curtsy at Mr. Rothbury Gray. Mr. Rothbury Gray, I thank you for the interview. The 3 matters are at the writing table for your Newcastle initial at the closing of the interview. Mr. Rothbury Gray set the Newcastle initials J.R.G. at the closed cover of the almanac, at the open letter, and at the green silk ribbon of the yearbook of 1818. He closed the Pilgrim Street Chambers ledger, gave the Newcastle nod at the west sash, and walked across the West Library to the door, where Mr. Allwinton held the door open. He did not look back at Sir Bertram. The Reverend Felton rose at the plain black gown brushed clean, gave Cecilia the small Fenwick on Coquet Parish nod he had kept for her since her arrival at the hall, and walked to the door at Mr. Rothbury Gray's elbow. The West Library door closed in the Northumberland fashion behind them. Sir Bertram Ogleby lifted the port-flushed head an inch from the folded forearms, did not look at Cecilia, did not look at the closed almanac, did not look at the green silk ribbon of the yearbook, and rose at the Morpeth heel. The mulberry silk waistcoat had set out a thin sheen of sweat at the silk. The thin mouth was set at the Morpeth line. He bowed at the West Library, in the fashion of a man who has lost the small good business he set out for at the south porch. Miss Fenwick. He walked to the West Library door, where Mr. Allwinton held it open. He did not look at the yearbook at the centre of the writing table. He passed without word, and the south porch door at the south hall closed at his footstep behind him. Cecilia Fenwick heard the carriage wheels at the south drive turn at the gravel and pass at the Southgate Piers and out at the Fenwick on Coquet Lane. She did not lift the small lace cap at the dark brown plaited knot at the nape. She set her plain right hand at the green silk ribbon of the yearbook of 1818 at the centre of the writing table, set the open letter of the 19th of September 1818 at the fold of pale cream paper at the thin black mourning ribbon, set the closed almanac at the small brass paperweight at her left elbow, and laid the dark blue observation journal at her right hand at the west sash. The thin pale west wind at the Coquet Valley at the south wharf had dropped at the south chimney. The sky, the colour of old pewter at the west sash, had lightened a half-shade at the Simonside ridge. The small Newcastle china pot of fresh ink at the writing table was still full at the rim. The second sash candle at the writing table was unlit at the brass holder. Cecilia lifted the small ivory-handled dividers at the dark blue observation journal at her right hand, opened the journal at the west sash light at the next blank leaf at the back of the closed-out quarter, and set the line at the head of the leaf in her plain Rothbury hand. Fenwick Hall, West Library. The full moon at Sir Bertram Ogilby's claim of parole trust of 3rd Port, August 1818. The moon at the change that day at 28 minutes past 5 in the evening by the Nautical Almanac for 1818. Printed at London 1815. The Commissioners of Longitude. No moon above the horizon of any county of England at any hour of the said night. Mrs. Octavia's yearbook of 1818 at the said night. Company none. The house dark. The great nebula in Andromeda at its brightest at 9 years. No moon at any hour. Miss Herschel's letter of 19th of September, 1818, at the same night at the darkest of skies. Claim withdrawn at Mr. Heddon at the writing table. Interview closed at Mr. Rothbury Gray at the said hour. The moon has settled it. She set the small ivory-handled dividers at the closed journal. She rose at the west sash, walked to the walnut cabinet at the northwest corner, set the yearbook of 1818 at its place at the shelf between the yearbooks of 1817 and 1819, and laid the small brass paperweight at the cabinet's reading shelf beside the black portfolio of Miss Herschel's letters. The West Library was quiet at the west sash. Mrs. Thropton, the Fenwick housekeeper, came at the West Library door at the border step, set the small Newcastle china tray with the strong Northumberland tea and a plate of the parlour-cut bread and coquet-haw butter at the writing table at Cecilia's right elbow, lifted the small curtsy at the west sash she kept for the heiress of Fenwick Hall at the close of a hard morning, and went out at the West Library door at the Northumberland fashion behind her. The old dog Mab came in at the open door at her stiff, gentle pace before it closed, and lay down at the chimney corner at the small fire at the manor of 13 years. Cecilia Fenwick set the small Newcastle china teacup at the strong Northumberland tea at the west sash light, and laid her soft, dove-grey eyes at the walled north garden at the west sash, where the thin, pale west wind had dropped at the south chimney, and the small octagonal star house stood quiet at the head wall above the bare damson tops, and the moon that had never stood at the midnight sky of the 31st of August 1818 had been at the change at 28 minutes past 5 of that evening, these 18 months past, and at every page of the almanac of the Commissioners of Longitude, and the matter at the writing table at the west sash was settled at the moon. The late winter at Fenwick settled into a careful rhythm that took Cecilia between the West Library at the Hall and the parsonage at Rothbury, a short 3 miles east of the home Hove. She kept Mondays at the parsonage with her widowed father, the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick, who held the curacy of All Saints Rothbury, as he had these 22 years past. She kept Tuesdays for the Fenwick parish poor, with Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's keys. She kept Wednesdays for the home Hove accounts, with Mr. Harbottle at the steward's strong cupboard. She kept Thursdays for the West Library writing table at her late great-aunt's own 35 yearbooks that Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had kept at the Star House since her marriage of 1784. She kept Fridays for her own 3 marbled observation books of 1815 to 1819 at the West Library. She kept Saturdays for the parish school star class at the South Porch with the 6 village girls Reverend Felton had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the 3rd Sunday of January. She kept Sundays for St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick-on-Coquet at the South Porch, and the rectory tea following with Reverend Felton, in the gentle Northumberland fashion the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had kept in her own day, and she kept the clear nights for the Star House at the walled garden head wall, the blued steel night key at the Black Ribbon, the great Dolland uncapped at the Stone Pier, the Yearbook of 1820, open at the deal writing shelf at its first entries in her own hand, and the old dog Mab at the meridian line at the threshold stone at the manor of the house. In the matter of the early border spring, Cecilia walked the home hearth and the lane at the foot of the Simonside Ridge through the February and into the early March, the two-drawer shagreen glass and the plain calf-bound field book laid at her hand, and she took the winter constellations down the west at the close of the long evenings and the first of the spring stars up the east at the small hours in her own dark blue observation journal, at the central crease in the careful Northumberland fashion of her 5 coquet seasons past. In the first week of February, Mrs. Thropton at the Brick Hob proposed Miss Tabitha Thropton, her niece of 23 at Thropton Village. Miss Tabitha Thropton was a small, fair, Thropton-bred young woman of plain dark wool and a settled honesty. The 6 Fenwick village girls of the Saturday Star class were named once at the Reverend Felton's parish school list in the West Library hand of Cecilia herself. Hannah Alwynton at 13, the butler's youngest niece at the village, Grace Harbottle at 12, the steward's eldest daughter at the Home Hall cottage, Dorcas Thropton at 14, the housekeeper's grandniece at Thropton Village, the small cousin of the reading companion Miss Tabitha at the West Library window, Prudence Felton at 11, the curate's middle daughter at the rectory, Mercy Rothbury Gray at 12, the Newcastle solicitor's grandniece lodging with her aunt at the village, and Sophie Hedden at 13, the village schoolmistress's daughter, no relation to Sir Bertram Ogilby's barrister of the Thursday past. These were the 6 who came over from the village on the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the gentle border spring. The parish school Saturday Star class at the South Porch was, in Cecilia's own settled understanding of the matter at the West Library writing table, the chief expansion of her late great-aunt's settled wish at the Fenwick yearbooks of 1784 to 1819. She had the 6 village girls at the South Porch from the early afternoon through the close of the afternoon, and she took up with them the gentle laying out of the Coquet Valley sky in the careful Ferguson fashion of the West Library reading voice. She laid at the South Porch reading table the small Jones portable orrery of Holborn at its mahogany box, and brought up from the West Library the celestial globe of Mr. Carey of the Strand at its mahogany tripod, and set the small ivory moon of the orrery at its brass arm at the gentle turn of the winding quay. She set Hannah Alwynton and Grace Harbottle at the new of the moon, and the first quarter at the orrery's ivory moon, the dark face and the growing west-lit half at the small brass sun-lamp in the plain Northumberland reckoning of the South Porch reading table. She set Dorcas Thropton and Prudence Felton at the full of the moon and the wane, the whole bright face at the sun's opposite, and the failing east-lit half at the small hours, in the plain Ferguson reckoning of the South Porch. She set Mercy Rothbury Gray and Sophie Hedden at the change, and the old moon, the moon at the sun's elbow, lost at the day sky, and at no night sky at all, in the plain Coquet Valley reckoning of the South Porch reading table. The 6 village girls each took up a small homemade copybook of plain Rothbury woolcloth at the cover that Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's keys had set up for the class at the South Press at the upper landing, and they began at the South Porch reading table their own small sketches of the moon's 8 faces in pencil and sable wash, copying down at the small reading table the gentle Ferguson observation Cecilia read out at the South Porch in her own gentle Northumberland reading voice. Cecilia at the South Porch set out before the 6 village girls at the close of the sketching hour, the settled principle that the late Mrs. Octavia had kept at the West Library writing table from her own Ferguson reading of 1784 onward, that the moon's 4 quarters succeed each other at a settled order through the month, the change and the first quarter and the full and the wane, each at its appointed day and its appointed hour, that the order may be computed at London 3 years before the night, and printed at a Blueboard's almanac for every ship of His Majesty's Navy, and that the order at the Coquet, at Fenwick on Coquet, and at Rothbury, and at the whole of the border country, was the same order the almanac set out at every county of the British sky. For the moon keeps one face and one reckoning over every county at the same hour, and its register may be read backward at any year as it may be read forward, and it does not mistake. The 6 village girls at the South Porch took down the settled principle of the moon's register at the South Porch reading table in the small homemade copybooks at the close of the sketching hour, and Cecilia at the South Porch closed the class hour with Mrs. Thropton at the brick hob bringing in the milk and honey at the South Porch, and the 6 village girls walking back at Mr. Harbottle's careful direction at the home-hof path to the village. By the close of the April, the 6 village girls of the Fenwick parish had each a small homemade copybook of pencil and sable wash of the moon's 8 faces drawn from the Jones Orrery at the South Porch reading table, with the settled Ferguson masculine principle of the moon's register at the inner cover of the small copybook in the West Library, hand of Cecilia herself. Mr. Harbottle walked the home-hof at his usual rounds through the late February and the early March, and reported the lambing at the wharf as fair for the year. The steward's strong cupboard rentals at the plain Northumberland, reckoning of the late Mrs. Octavia's own books these many years past, and the damson and apple orchard at the West, at 3 acres of border damsons and russets, as settled at the Rothbury dressing. The Wednesday of the 15th of March came in upon Fenwick with the soft, pale yellow border light of an early spring afternoon at the West Library writing table, and Cecilia, at the West Library writing table, drew down from the walnut cabinet the yearbook of 1792 at the plain dark oak reading chair the late Mrs. Octavia had kept at the south wall. She had not before opened the yearbook of 1792 at the June, having read through the years of 1784 to 1791 at the close of the Sir Bertram Ogleby matter, and the years of 1793 to 1810 at the dark oak of the February. The yearbook of 1792 was a plain dark green calf at the Newcastle binder, with the italic of Mrs. Octavia Fenwick at the inner leaves, and Cecilia turned through twice the pages of the spring of 1792, and came at the close of her turning to the page of the 7th of June 1792 at the Star House at Fenwick. She found at that page laid in at the margin a small ink sketch of the pole star at the meridian line of the Star House threshold, the small steady point at the head of the thin brass line, the careful north mark at the gentle close of a June evening, and at the margin of the sketch, in the italic of her late great-aunt's own hand, a settled marginal note. This 7th June 1792, the morning of dear Ambrose's marriage, to my niece Miss Dorothea Ogleby at All Saints of Rothbury. I have at this morning bought of the instrument maker at the side at Newcastle a small 2-drawer pocket perspective glass in green shagreen, and at this evening I have taken the pole star at the meridian line at the threshold, as at every clear night these 8 years. The pole star does not remove. My niece's first child shall have her own glass at the Star House in her own time. The ledgers shall stand at the West Library for that hand. O.F. The 7th of June 1792 was the morning of her own father's wedding at All Saints of Rothbury to her late mother, Mrs. Dorothea Ogleby Fenwick, the marriage Cecilia had heard of in passing at the parsonage south parlour in her father's plain Northumberland reserve at the small Newcastle miniature of the Ogleby family of 1792 at the south parlour writing desk, and the small two-drawer pocket perspective glass in green shagreen was the same small glass that had come at Cecilia's own hand at her 15th birthday at the parsonage south parlour at the March of 1808, at her father's plain word that the glass had been put by for her, and at no further word at any year since, the same shagreen glass that had hung at the black ribbon at her waist at every clear night of her 5 croquet seasons, and that hung at the black ribbon at her waist at the West Library writing table at that very hour. Mrs. Octavia had bought the glass at the side at Newcastle on the morning of the wedding, 8 months before Cecilia was born, and had laid it by at the Star House for the first child of the niece, and the first child of the niece had carried it at her waist these 12 years and had not known the hand it came of. The Ogleby name at the small Newcastle miniature was the same Ogleby name of Sir Bertram Ogleby of Ogleby Hall near Morpeth, who had sat at the West Library of Fenwick at the Thursday of the 27th of January past. Mrs. Octavia Eleanor Fenwick had been born an Ogleby, the only sister of the late Sir Gervase Ogleby, the 2nd Baronet, and of Mr. Lucius Ogleby of Hexham. Sir Bertram was the second son of the late Sir Gervase, and the late Mrs. Dorothea Ogleby Fenwick was the only daughter of Mr. Lucius Ogleby of Hexham, the niece of Mrs. Octavia by the Ogleby line, and Sir Bertram Ogleby was Cecilia's own distant cousin of the 2nd degree at the Ogleby line of the Morpeth family. The first child of the niece had been laid at the parsonage of Rothbury at the Northumberland March of 1793, and the first child of the niece, Mrs. Dorothea Ogleby Fenwick, was Cecilia herself. Mrs. Octavia had laid aside the yearbook of 1792, 28 years before, for the first child of the niece. Cecilia closed the yearbook of 1792 and stood at the West Library window in the soft, pale yellow border light of the early spring afternoon, in a settled silence of 10 minutes. The West Library window gave at the walled north garden and the damson tops and the small octagonal star house at the head wall above the home hearth, and the soft border light stood at the West Library writing table at the yearbook of 1792 at the page of the 7th of June. Mrs. Thropton at the brick hob in the kitchen at the south passage was silent at the housekeeper's keys. Cecilia took up her own dark blue observation journal at the dark oak reading table at the West Library window, and copied down at the central crease in her own italic the entry of the 7th of June, 1792, of Mrs. Octavia's yearbook, the small ink sketch of the pole star at the meridian line, the italic marginal note of her late great-aunt's hand at the wedding morning of her niece, and the settled wish of Mrs. Octavia that the ledges should be for the hand of the first child of the niece. She laid the yearbook at the West Library writing table at the close of the entry, and laid her own dark blue observation journal at the central crease at the dark oak reading table, and set her ungloved hand a moment at the small shagreen glass at the black ribbon at her waist. The matter of the yearbook of 1792 at the page of the 7th of June was settled at Fenwick at the close of the spring afternoon, in the plain Northumberland, reckoning of the border parishes. Lady Day, quarter day at the 25th of March, brought Mr. Harbottle to the West Library writing table, with the home hearth accounts and the steward's strong cupboard rentals settled at the plain Northumberland, reckoning of the late Mrs. Octavia's own books, the rentals of the Fenwick border parish tenancies at the home hearth, and the damson and apple orchard, and the walled north garden, and the Star House pavilion at the head wall, brought up at the plain steward's hand of his 24 years at the Fenwick, living in the plain fashion her late great-aunt had kept of the Lady Day quarter day these many years past. By the close of the March, the half-mourning at Fenwick had eased by the gentle Northumberland reckoning of the 4 months past the December of 1819, and Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's keys produced from the late Mrs. Octavia's south press at the upper landing a dove-grey and lavender-sprigged muslin morning gown of the Newcastle dressmaker's hand of 1819 that Mrs. Octavia had not lived to take into wear. Cecilia took the muslin into wear at the Easter, in the gentle Northumberland fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day, the unrelieved black bombazine set by at the upper press. Easter Sunday, at the 2nd of April 1820, came in upon Fenwick on Coquet, in the soft pale yellow border light of the early April morning at St. Cuthbert's. Reverend Felton preached the Easter sermon from the Epistle of the Morning, in his plain Northumberland fashion, at the south pulpit of St. Cuthbert's. Mr. Alwynton at the south door of the church had received the parish at the south porch in the early morning, and Mrs. Thropton at the Fenwick pew at the south aisle had laid the Fenwick pew cushions at the dark oak. Cecilia at the Fenwick pew, in her dove-grey and lavender sprigged muslin and a small sprig of early coquet blackthorn flower at the bodice, took the parish Easter service in the gentle Northumberland fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this pew these many years past. After the close of the service, the parish came out at the south porch of St. Cuthbert's into the soft, pale yellow border light of the Easter Sunday late morning, and Reverend Felton at the south porch inclined to a tall, spare, slate-blue-coated gentleman who had stood at the rear of the south aisle through the service and who had come forward at the close to the south porch. Lord Peregrine Embleton was tall, spare, 6'0", dark brown hair lately silvering at the temple, steady grey eyes the colour of the March coquet, gentle firm mouth, weathered fair Cambridge trained skin, slate-blue morning coat over a dove waistcoat, the silver Embleton signet at the right hand. Reverend Felton at the south porch inclined to Cecilia, and inclined to his lordship, and made the introduction in his settled Northumberland fashion, verbatim at the south porch of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick on Coquet. Miss Fenwick, his lordship Peregrine, Charles Embleton, 4th Viscount Embleton of Embleton Park, 10 miles east in the Alne Valley near Alnwick. Lord Embleton is the lay patron of the Fenwick living these 9 years past, a Fellow of the Royal Society these 4 years past, and at the January last one of the first founding members of the new Astronomical Society of London. Lord Embleton at the south porch inclined to Cecilia in the Cambridge-trained Northumberland fashion of the border parishes. He observed, at the south porch in his settled plain manner, that he had known the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick from the year of his own coming down to Embleton Park in 1811 through to her last autumn of 1819 at the matter of the Coquet Valley sweeps, and that he had seen her figured sweep cards at the Royal Society's reading room at every season since 1812. He observed that at the parish school inspection of the October of 1819, Reverend Felton had laid at his hand at the rectory writing table one of the late Mrs. Octavia's own figured sweep cards, the great nebula in Andromeda, at the August of 1818, the field sketched at the 5-foot Dolland with the small companion nebula at the south edge, and the small italic captions of the late Mrs. Octavia's hand at the lower margin in the plain slough reckoning of Miss Herschel's correspondence, and that he had at the time remarked at the Reverend Felton's hand the small marginal note at the moon's change at the almanac's appointment that Lord Embleton had not before seen at any of the border astronomers' hands. He observed, in his plain Northumberland manner at the south porch, that he had not in his 9 years at Embleton Park expected to see that hand continue at the West Library writing table after the December of 1819, and that the matter of the parish school Saturday star class at the south porch through the late winter and the early spring had been brought to his hand at Embleton Park by the Reverend Felton at the 3 Sunday rectory teas past. Cecilia at the south porch, in her dove grey and lavender sprigged muslin, and the small sprig of early coquet blackthorn at the bodice, received Lord Embleton's settled observation in the gentle Northumberland fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day at this porch. She inclined to his lordship in the manner of the Rothbury parsonage of her own girlhood. She replied at the south porch in her own settled trait, in the plain Northumberland fashion of the border parishes. Lord Embleton, the year-books at Fenwick I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Embleton at the south porch inclined to Cecilia at the close of her sentence, and observed that he was glad of the matter, and that he should hope to make his settled call at the West Library at Fenwick at the Tuesday following the close of Easter week, if the new mistress of the hall should receive him at the West Library at the gentle Northumberland hour the late Mrs. Octavia had kept for her own Tuesday calls in her own day. Cecilia at the south porch, in the soft, pale yellow border light of the Easter Sunday late morning, inclined to Lord Embleton, and replied that she should receive Lord Embleton at the West Library at the Tuesday call the late great-aunt had kept in her own day, and the matter at the south porch was settled in the plain Northumberland fashion of the border parishes. Reverend Felton at the south porch walked Cecilia and Lord Embleton to the lich gate of St. Cuthbert's at the south churchyard wall, where the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's plain Newcastle set memorial stone of December 1819 stood at the south wall at the third grave from the lich gate. Lord Embleton at the lich gate took his leave of Reverend Felton and of Cecilia in the Cambridge-trained Northumberland fashion, and walked at the south churchyard path to the Embleton Park carriage at the rectory wall. Cecilia, at the lich gate, took her own leave of Reverend Felton in the plain Northumberland fashion of the border parishes, and walked back at the south churchyard path to the south door of Fenwick Hall. Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's keys, 3 paces behind in plum bombazine and lace cap. Cecilia at the south door of Fenwick Hall inclined to Mrs. Thropton at the close of the half-mile, and Mrs. Thropton at the south door took the dove-grey muslin bonnet at the inner hall in the plain Northumberland fashion of the late Mrs. Octavia's own day. The matter of the south porch at the Easter Sunday of the 2nd of April was settled at Fenwick at the plain Northumberland, reckoning of the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick's own settled wish. Tuesday the 11th of April 1820 came in upon Fenwick Hall at a pale border morning of fresh April green at the Holmhof and pearl-grey weather upon the Simonside ridge above the Coquet, and at not much past 2 of the afternoon, Mr. Alwynton at the south door announced the carriage from Embleton Park, 10 miles east in the Alne Valley. Lord Peregrine Charles Embleton, the 4th Viscount, came up the gravel sweep in his slate-blue morning coat over a dove waistcoat at the patient pace of a 42-year-old widower of 4 years, dark brown hair, lately silvering at the temple, steady grey eyes the colour of the March coquet set at the south front of the manor, and at his left hand his small daughter, Lady Rosamond Embleton, at her 9 years in soft rose-pink ribbons and a cream muslin pelisse, the dark chestnut hair plaited at the nape, the warm brown eyes plain at the squared sandstone south porch. Behind Lord Embleton came down at the gravel 3 Embleton-Selby connections, Lady Augusta Embleton Selby, his elder sister of 41 in dove-grey poplin, Lady Maud Embleton Selby, his cousin of 39 in slate silk, and Lady Edith Embleton Selby, his younger sister of 37 in a plain walking bonnet, and at their hand Mr. Roger Selby, Mr. Osmond Selby, and Mr. Henry Selby in plain dark wool. The Dowager Lady Embleton at 67 in plum and grey bombazine came down last at her son's hand. Mrs. Thropton received the Embleton party at the West Library at the close of the 2nd hour. The long, warm room of the west front lay open at the fresh April light at the west mullioned windows, the squared sandstone chimney-piece at the north wall, the 426 volumes at the east and south shelves, and at the northwest corner, the walnut cabinet of the 35 yearbooks at Mrs. Octavia's hand. Mrs. Thropton, in her lace cap and plum bombazine, set out the Newcastle tea service of 1787 at the round mahogany table by the second sash, and poured the tea at the Northumberland fashion of the Fenwick household. The dowager took the chair at the round table at Cecilia's left hand, Lady Rosamond the small chair at Cecilia's right, Lord Embleton the chair at the west sash, and the Embleton-Selby cousins at the long oak table. Mr. Elwinton stood at the west door at the household's plain Northumberland courtesy. Lord Embleton took his Newcastle cup at the saucer and set it down and turned at his place at the round mahogany table. Miss Fenwick, I have read the privately printed quarto your late great-aunt set down at the Comet of 1811 in the spring of 1812, the small 150-page Newcastle press at the Fenwick Yearbooks correspondence, and at Embleton Park, the North Library of my own dear Lady Isabel stood at the Alne Valley skies laying out at the 7 years of her keeping the moon map, and at her death in the September of 1816, the North Library was closed at the map table and has not been laid out at the 4 years following. I am of the Royal Society at the 1816 election, and of the New Astronomical Society of London at the January founding dinner. And I should ask whether you might consent to lay out at the Embleton Park North Library across the summer the small Northumberland sky demonstration that my late wife had not the strength to set down at her closing year, against the parish school's 6-girl Saturday class she had begun at the spring of 1816. The matter wants only the Fenwick hand at the yearbooks. Cecilia set down her own Newcastle cup at the saucer at the round mahogany table. Lord Embleton, the Embleton Park North Library demonstration shall be laid out at the Northumberland fashion the late Lady Isabel had begun at the 1816 spring. I shall come over at the Tuesday at 3 at the Embleton gig at Mrs. Thropton's chaperonage, and the autumn constellations shall stand at the table at her quiet order. Lady Rosamond at the round table looked up at her father, at his place at the west sash, and then at Cecilia at her left hand, and she set down her own small Newcastle cup at the small saucer. Miss Fenwick, may I help with the moon map at the Embleton North Library? Mamma had laid out the sea of showers at the 4th drawer at the map table in the spring of 1816, and she had not finished the naming at her closing year. Lady Rosamond, the moon map at the 4th drawer at the Embleton map table shall be laid out at your own hand at the Tuesday afternoons in the Northumberland fashion the late Lady Isabel had kept at her own North Library. The Wednesday of the 19th of April brought the Reverend Felton over from the rectory to the West Library tea, and he confirmed, in his Northumberland reserve at the West Library window, that Mrs. Octavia Fenwick, at her last conversation at her south bedchamber in the November of 1819, had asked him to bring My Small North Star, the late Mrs. Octavia's own settled name for Cecilia at the parsonage these many years past, the yearbook of 1792, at the page of the 7th of June of the small shagreen glass of the side, at Newcastle, with my settled asking pardon. He asked Cecilia's pardon for the plain Northumberland delay of the confirmation, the Sir Bertram Ogleby matter having been let pass first. The Reverend Felton observed at the West Library window, in his plain Fenwick parish curate's manner, that the late Mrs. Octavia had at the south bedchamber asked him to lay the matter at Cecilia's hand at the parish curate's own settled discretion, and that she had asked him further to say at the West Library, in her own settled wording, that the 3 short miles between Fenwick Hall and the Rothbury parsonage had been at her hand to bridge from the spring of 1792 onward, the spring of her own niece's wedding, to dear Ambrose at All Saints of Rothbury, that she had not, in the matter of the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick of Rothbury, and the parting of 1793, at the Ogleby Hall settlement, when the Ogleby family had withheld the marriage portion of the niece who had married a poor curate, and Mrs. Octavia had not at the time set herself across her brother's settled word, brought herself to the bridge, and that the yearbook of 1792, the small shagreen glass of the side laid in on her niece's wedding morning for the first child of the niece, was the matter she had meant the small North Star to take up at the West Library writing table in her own time. Cecilia received the Reverend Felton's confirmation at the West Library window in her own settled silence, and asked the Reverend Felton to take the West Library tea in the plain Northumberland fashion her late great-aunt had kept on the rectory tea Wednesdays of her own day. Mrs. Thropton at the Brick Hob, laying the small Fenwick tea service of 1787 at the West Library writing table. In the middle of April, Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's keys brought up the Fenwick pearls, a single strand of small Tyne River pearls set at the Newcastle goldsmiths of 1787 in a worn dark calf case. The pearls Sir Lionel Fenwick had set at the Newcastle goldsmiths for his bride, Mrs. Octavia Fenwick, at the spring of 1787, the pearls Mrs. Octavia had kept at the upper press at the South Landing through her widowhood of 1806 to 1819, and laid them on the West Library writing table at Cecilia's own settled wish. The Saturday of the 29th of April, at the South Porch, at the close of the star-class hour, the 6 village girls presented Cecilia at the South Porch reading table with a small calf-bound album of the Coquet hedgerow flowers the 6 girls had gathered through the early spring at the home haw and the damson orchard, and the village schoolmistress Mrs. Heddon's own well-used copy of Mr. Ferguson's 1768 An Easy Introduction to Astronomy for Young Gentlemen and Ladies, in plain Rothbury woolcloth. At the cover, the album laid at the reading table at Cecilia's hand by Hannah Alwynton at the close of the class hour. The Tuesday calls began at Tuesday the 18th of April, at the Embleton gig at 3 at the South Porch. Mrs. Thropton took her bonnet at the South Hall and went over at the 10-mile road east to Embleton Park, and Cecilia, at the small Cambridge gig at Lord Embleton's right hand, carried the dark blue observation journal and the shagreen glass and a small black portfolio of Mrs. Octavia's figured sweep cards of 1818. And the late spring border weather lay quiet at the home hearth at the soft pace of the April country. At Embleton Park, the North Library lay open at the round mahogany reading table and the long oak map table at the north windows. The moon map of Lady Isabel's keeping closed at the map drawers these 4 years, Lord Embleton's own 1817 privately printed quarto. Observations on the double stars and the comet of 1811, made at Embleton Park in the county of Northumberland, Cambridge Press, 47 pages, laid at the reading stand at the second sash. Cecilia took the quarto in her ungloved hand and read at the italic preface the careful Cambridge astronomy of Lord Embleton's own hand, and the late Lady Isabel's moon table at page 9, and the comet diagram at the folded plate at page 120, and she did not speak at the first reading, because the quarto stood at the Northumberland Sky Order. Mrs. Octavia's own yearbooks had stood at the West Library at Fenwick Hall. The Reverend Ambrose Fenwick came over from the Rothbury parsonage at the second Tuesday for the spring fortnight, and took the second sash at his curate's plain dark wool and his quiet reading-hour patience, and through the fortnight of the early May, the widowed Rothbury curate at his daughter's chaperone's side, read the late Lady Isabel's 1816 moon table at page 9, and the comet diagram at page 120 at the parsonage italic he had kept at All Saints Rothbury these 22 years. Miss Fenwick, Lord Embleton said at the third Tuesday at the round mahogany reading table, I had set the comet of 1811 at the plate at page 120, at a single stream of the tail, at my own Embleton 3-foot of that autumn. But I had not at the printing of the quarto considered the distinction your own great-aunt's yearbook of 1811 carried at the September and the October sweeps, the 2 streams of the tail at the 5-foot Dolland, the longer at the north and the shorter at the south, drawn at the micrometer's measure at 9 clear nights. I had at the 1817 printing set the matter as a single stream. The distinction wants to stand at the 2nd edition. Lord Embleton. The distinction is Mrs. Octavia's. I had only the late great-aunt's yearbook of 1811 at the walnut cabinet of the West Library at Fenwick Hall. Miss Fenwick. The Fenwick hand carried it down at Mrs. Octavia's yearbook at the West Library, and it shall stand at the 2nd edition of the Observations at the page 120 plate at your own laying out. The matter shall stand at the Cambridge Press. On the soft late afternoon of Tuesday the 16th of May, the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick at the 2nd sash had laid down his Embleton quarto at the reading shelf and stepped out at the north garden for the half-hour before dressing, and Mrs. Thropton at the chaperone's chair had risen at the housekeeper's keys and gone down at the still room at the Embleton Park, quiet order. Cecilia at the round mahogany reading table, and Lord Embleton at her right hand, read together at the quiet Embleton silence, the comet diagram at page 120, and Lord Embleton laid his ungloved hand at the broad outer margin of the folded plate at the small fair second, when Cecilia's hand came down at the same margin to mark the page corner, and the 2 hands rested at the page corner in the gentle Northumberland silence, the 2nd of 3, and Cecilia lifted her soft dove-grey eyes at the silence, and met his steady grey eyes at the round table, and Lord Embleton did not move his hand at the page corner, and Cecilia did not move her hand at the page corner, and the border afternoon light came in at the north sash at the pale fair gold of the middle May. The Wednesday walks began on Wednesday the 3rd of May at the home hall above the Coquet. Lord Embleton came over at the Cambridge gig at 4. Mrs. Thropton took her bonnet at the South Hall and walked at the dry stone wall 10 paces behind in her plum bombazine and lace cap, and Lord Embleton and Cecilia walked the home hof at the fair border evening at the steady pace of the May country at the north bank above the Coquet, the Simonside ridge, fresh at the May bracken across the valley, and the river at the low bright water at the bend below the damson orchard. On Wednesday the 19th of July, at the dry stone wall at the south corner of the home wharf, where the midsummer Coquet harebells stood at full flower at the small blue stand against the squared sandstone at the wharf rising fair above the river, Lord Embleton stopped at the wall and gathered at his own hand a small sprig of the blue-belled Coquet harebell at the quiet Northumberland silence. He turned at the wall and gave it at Cecilia's ungloved hand in the gentle Northumberland silence, the 2nd of 2, the upper Coquet wind at the south of the wharf at the fair July evening. Cecilia took the sprig at her ungloved hand, did not speak, and laid the blue-belled sprig at the inner linen pouch of her muslin pelisse against the small cloth she had kept the eyepiece cleaning cloth in at her quiet Northumberland habit since the autumn of 1815. The Saturday calls began at Lord Embleton's request at the West Library at 3 at the 1st of July. Lady Rosamond came over at every second Saturday at her father's gig and helped at the Moon's Faces at the Jones Orrery with the 6 village girls at the South Porch class hour. Mrs. Thropton laid out plain seed cake and the Newcastle service at the round table, and the fair border afternoon stood plain at the west sash these 5 Saturdays of the July and the early August. On Saturday, the 5th of August at 3, the Cambridge gig came in at the gravel sweep, and Lord Embleton laid at the West Library a small bound volume of Mr. Ferguson's 1756 Astronomy, explained upon Sir Isaac Newton's principles. At the round mahogany table, the engraved plate of the moon's shadow at the eclipse of the sun at the marker, The clock at the West Library struck 3 at the small Northumberland chime at the moment Mr. Alwynton closed the west door. Miss Fenwick, may I call at the Saturday following at 3? Lord Embleton, you are very welcome at the Saturday. On Saturday, the 12th of August at 3 at the Fair Border afternoon, the West Library laid out at the Newcastle service at the round mahogany table, the home hearth at the south sash, standing fresh at the second hay harvest above the coquet, the Simonside ridge at the first purple of the August heather. Mrs. Thropton at the chaperone's chair at the second sash had risen at the housekeeper's keys at the south corridor, at the quiet Northumberland minute, and left the West Library door at the broad gentle border afternoon gold. Lord Embleton set his Newcastle cup at the saucer at the round table, and stood at his place at Cecilia's right hand. The clock at the West Library struck 3 at the small Northumberland chime at the closing of the west door behind Mrs. Thropton. Miss Fenwick, I am of an age and a Cambridge widower's quiet gravity that shall not lay out the matter at the long Northumberland preface. I have called at the Tuesday reading hours these 17 Tuesdays past, and at the Wednesday walks these 15 Wednesdays past, and the warm Northumberland regard at my own fair Cambridge hand has at no Tuesday and at no Wednesday been other than fair and steady and plain. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have read the gentle italic of your observation books these 4 months, and known by your late great-aunt's 1792 shagreen glass note that your hand is the next hand at the Fenwick yearbooks, to do me the honour of becoming the next Lady Embleton. Lady Rosamond, at her 9 years, has read the matter at her own hand these 3 months past at the Embleton Park moon map, and at the Wednesday last she said at the carriage home that the sea of showers at the 4th drawer wanted only the gentle Fenwick hand at the Rothbury parsonage italic to lay her mamma's North Library out at her own fair order at the Embleton Park Lady Day. I am asking at the Saturday afternoon in the gentle Northumberland fashion, at her own quiet voice, and at the late Lady Isabel's quiet blessing kept these 4 years past. I shall stand at the West Library, at the gentle Northumberland silence, at the second of your answer. Cecilia at the round mahogany table laid down her Newcastle cup at the saucer, and stood at her own place at Lord Embleton's left hand. Lord Embleton, I shall. I have laid out the Northumberland italic at the West Library since my great-aunt's hand came down at the will at the 6th of January, and I have read the comet diagram at page 120 of the Embleton quarto at your own fair Cambridge hand these 17 Tuesdays, and I have walked the home hall at the gentle border evening these 15 Wednesdays, and the small sprig of coquet harebell you laid at my hand at the dry stone wall at the quiet Northumberland silence on Wednesday the 19th of July stands at the linen pouch at the eyepiece cleaning cloth at the West Library's second drawer at the gentle parsonage italic. I shall. Lord Embleton took her ungloved hand at the round mahogany table at the small fair Northumberland second of 3. Miss Fenwick, I shall ride at the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick at the Rothbury parsonage at 6 this evening with your fair leave. I shall ride at Mr. Rothbury Grey at the Pilgrim Street Chambers at the Monday following at Newcastle. The banns shall be read at St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick on Coquet at the Sunday of the 20th, and at the Sunday of the 27th of August, and at the Sunday of the 3rd of September at the parish church. The matter shall stand at the Northumberland Register. Lady Rosamond came in at the West Library door, at the small Northumberland minute past 3, at her own quiet reading-hour pace at the gravel sweep, the rose-pink ribbons at the plat, the warm brown eyes plain at the round mahogany table, and stopped at the threshold at the fair border afternoon gold at the west sash. Papa, has Miss Fenwick said yes at the West Library? Lady Rosamond, Miss Fenwick has said yes at the West Library at the round mahogany table. Then the sea of showers at the 4th drawer of the map table at Mamma's North Library shall be laid out at the Lady Day, following at the gentle Fenwick italic, and I shall help at the Embleton Park Parish School Saturday at the Fair 6 girl class at the Alne Valley. Cecilia laid her ungloved hand at Lady Rosamond's small, dark chestnut head at the West Library threshold at the quiet Northumberland minute. Lady Rosamond, you shall help at the Sea of Showers at the 4th drawer and at the Embleton Park Parish School Saturday class. The matter shall stand at the Embleton Park Lady Day. The Reverend Felton read the banns of marriage between Lord Peregrine Charles Embleton, 4th Viscount Embleton of Embleton Park, and Miss Cecilia Anne Fenwick, of Fenwick Hall at St. Cuthbert's, of Fenwick on Coquet at morning prayer, on Sunday the 20th, Sunday the 27th of August, and Sunday the 3rd of September, at the small Northumberland chime of 10. No impediment laid out at the parish gate at any Sunday of 3. The parish clerk, Mr. Cartington, entering the matter at the parish register at the 2nd column in plain black ink. The Thursday of the 7th of September 1820 came in upon Fenwick Hall at a high clean border sky, and at the middle of the day the great eclipse of the sun came at the Coquet Valley at the almanac's appointment, as the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had set down at the foot of her last page. Cecilia, at the Star House, had the great Dolland at the white card at the deal shelf at the casting of the sun's image, and the cards of smoked glass from the cedar slip case went hand to hand at the walled north garden. Lord Embleton at her right, the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick at the garden bench, Lady Rosamond and the 6 village girls of the Saturday class at the gravel walk, Mrs. Thropton and Mr. Alwynton and Mr. Harbottle at the garden gate, and the old dog Mab at the meridian line at the threshold stone. The sun, at the deepest of the wane, stood at the white card a thin bright sickle. The light over the wharf went the colour of old pewter. The rooks came home at the damson orchard at the wrong hour. The air took the small September chill. At the close of the eclipse, Cecilia went in at the Star House, opened the year-book of 1819, at the last page at the line of her late great-aunt's slow italic, and wrote beneath it at her own plain Rothbury hand. Observed at the Star House at Fenwick, the 7th of September 1820, the great eclipse of the sun, at the almanac's appointment, and at hers, for Mrs. Octavia Fenwick, at her settled asking. The heavens kept their appointment. C.F.E.A. On Saturday the 16th of September, 1820 at 10 at the small Northumberland chime, the parish church of St. Cuthbert's of Fenwick on Coquet stood at the gentle fair border morning at the late hawthorn at the churchyard wall, the home-hearth beyond the south meadow at the fresh September short grass, the Coquet at the south fields at the fair low flow. Mrs. Workswell, the village dressmaker, had laid out the bride's gown at the Fenwick south parlour at the Friday evening, cream Northumberland muslin morning gown at the fair border cut, the small sprig of late Coquet harebell at the bodice with one white and cream rose at the walled garden south wall, the Fenwick pearls in the Newcastle setting of 1787 at the throat, the ivory silk gloves at the wrists, and at the inner pocket of the cream muslin at her own quiet hand, Cecilia had laid the small silver locket of her late mother, Mrs. Dorothea Ogleby Fenwick, that had stood at the Rothbury parsonage, second drawer these 19 years past, and at the black ribbon at her waist, the small 2-drawer shagreen glass of the side at Newcastle, bought at the morning of her parents' wedding, by the hand that had named her its own small North Star. Mr. Rothbury Grey, in plain dark broadcloth, and his silver spectacles handed Cecilia at the south gravel sweep, and walked her at the gentle Northumberland pace at the south porch of St. Cuthbert's. The Reverend Ambrose Fenwick, her father, took the front pew at the fair, morning at the small Northumberland chime. Lady Rosamond, at the second pew in soft rose-pink muslin, sat at her grandmother, the Dowager Lady Embleton, at the plum and grey bombazine. Lady Augusta Embleton Selby and Mr. Roger Selby took the third pew, Lady Maud Embleton Selby and Mr. Osmond Selby the fourth, and Lady Edith Embleton Selby and Mr. Henry Selby V, Mrs. Thropton at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Harbottle at the home hearth, Mr. Alwynton at the south door, and Miss Tabitha Thropton at the reading companion's chair, took the parish gallery at the gentle Northumberland fashion the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had kept all her days at the upper coquet. The Reverend Felton, in plain black gown, read the solemnization at the small Northumberland chime of 10 at the gentle fair September morning. Mr. Rothbury Grey gave the bride away at the gentle Northumberland pace at the chancel step. Lord Embleton at the chancel rail in plain dark blue, morning coat and dove waistcoat, laid the Newcastle gold ring at Cecilia's ungloved fourth finger at the gentle Northumberland second, and the parish register at the vestry table was signed at Lord Embleton's hand, and at Cecilia's hand, and at Mr. Rothbury Grey's hand, and at the Reverend Ambrose Fenwick's hand, in the Reverend Felton's quiet Northumberland italic, at the fair morning of the 16th of September, 1820. The wedding breakfast was laid out at the south dining room at Fenwick Hall, at noon at the gentle Northumberland fashion. Plain cold ham and border mutton, and the seed cake the late Mrs. Octavia Fenwick had kept at the Lady Day calls these 30 years past. Fresh coquet Hove butter at the small Newcastle dish, the warm singing hinnies at the cream plate, and the late hothouse peaches at the cut-glass stand from the Embleton Park kitchen garden. The Newcastle service of 1787 stood at the long mahogany table, the home hearth at the south sash at the fresh September short grass. The Reverend Ambrose Fenwick spoke a brief Northumberland grace at the head of the table at noon. The Dowager Lady Embleton answered the amen at her quiet voice at the second chair. Lady Rosamond at the third chair held her grandmother's hand at the seed-cake plate. The Dowager Lady Embleton laid her quiet hand at the new Lady Embleton's at the south dining-room door at 1:30, and the Cambridge chariot took Lord Embleton and his bride at the gentle Northumberland pace at the Alne Valley at the fair September afternoon to Embleton Park at the 4 o'clock chime of the long parish day. If you have stayed with me to the close of this story, I should be glad of one small word from you in the comments below. Tell me the county or the country you are listening from this evening, and one quiet kindness you have lately received that you have not yet had the chance to repay. If this story has been a comfort to your hour, do press the small bell beside the subscribe ribbon at this channel, so that the next Whispers of Love story shall find you in its turn. Until then, be at your ease, and at your candle, and at your hour. Whispers of Love. Mr. Harbottle continued at the home hearth. Mrs. Thropton continued at the housekeeper's keys. The quarter-day audit went forward at Michaelmas. Miss Tabitha Thropton continued at the West Library evenings with the yearbooks at her hand, and the old dog Mab kept the Star House threshold at the clear nights. Outside, the Northumberland sky turned the colour of slate after rain at the close of the September day, and the coquet ran the colour of pewter at the south hearth. So Miss Cecilia Fenwick, who had sat in gentle Northumberland silence at the south parlour window of the Rothbury parsonage on the soft Tuesday morning of the 21st of December, and finished the winter solstice reduction at her dark blue observation journal, became, by the patient asking of the 4th Viscount Embleton, the 6th Lady Embleton of Embleton Park, in the gentle Northumberland fashion, her own late mother, Mrs. Dorothea Ogleby Fenwick, had kept all her days.